Simon gasped for breath as the orc's huge hand, its tendons severed, squeezed his neck, and one of the soldiers shouted that they had to save him. The orc growled in a deep, rough voice, as if he was trying to say something or challenge them. And Yuri, with a doubtful voice, asked Jamie if the creature was trying to take Simon hostage. Jamie replied that he would call a translator, and soon a figure wrapped in a strange black cloak stepped forward. He was ordered to translate, and then Corey, a man with a menacing face and protruding fangs, came into view and assessed the situation. Yuri, taken aback, muttered Corey's name, who confirmed that it was indeed him. Corey put his hand to his ear and began to translate, reporting that the orc had threatened to break every bone in the knight's body if the soldiers did not immediately drop their weapon. The ferocious orc still had Simon by the neck, his grip unwavering as he growled his threats. But at that moment, Hernando stepped forward, assuming a confident pose, and began to read the spell. A stream of light poured from his hand as he concentrated, and when he extended his glowing hand towards the orc, a magical aura formed between them. Then he shouted a signal, and Yuri, hearing the command, quickly turned around, praised Hernando for his excellent work, and then rushed towards the orc. Yuri jumped up to the creature and grabbed Simon, tearing him out of the orc's grip before he could react. And after saving Simon, the orc's rage flared up with renewed vigor. He stamped his foot on the ground. His eyes glowed red with fury, and he let out a furious roar as the others stared at the orc's menacing appearance. Feeling that this was no ordinary orc, to which Haim replied that this was an ordinary orc, but with a huge amount of experience. He explained that when they first caught him, he was single-handedly devouring a knight, and that same orc had taken many lives. A soldier standing nearby, overhearing this, angrily shouted that he didn't care whether the monster was a prisoner, because he wanted to kill him personally. But Yuri quickly approached to calm him down. He asked the soldier to pull himself together, and then explained that he had not stopped him out of pity, and told him to look behind the orc. Yuri pointed to the red eyes watching from the darkness behind him, and continued, noting that they were all waiting for the right moment to strike. He warned that the enemies in the prairie would be more terrible, patted the soldier on the shoulder, and reminded him that this was just training and a chance to learn how to kill orcs. A massive orc stood before them, bloodthirsty and poised to attack. The knights raised their swords in unison, ready to engage. The orc, clutching a box filled with fire in his hands, rushed forward to strike, but Hernando immediately erected a magical shield, creating a barrier that blocked the attack. The orc never managed to reach Yuri and Jamie, who remained calm and observant. One of the knights immediately rushed forward, and he pierced him with his sword, drawing blood from the monster's neck. He immediately fell down dead. But it was too early to rejoice, and the warrior turned around in shock, seeing the monster standing in front of him again, swinging its arm to trample him into the ground. However, another young knight immediately jumped up to them and blocked the monster's blow with his sword, and then the monster coughed up blood in shock. And again he fell dead forever, because the guy was able to pierce him with a sword. Yuri applauded the blow and praised the knight for his excellent work. However, the soldiers were in no hurry to celebrate. Their faces were clouded with sadness, and Yuri asked them if they weren't happy. Looking at the orc's corpse, he admitted that fighting a defenseless enemy was logical, since this experience would increase their chances of surviving the battle, and told the boys to thank Jamie. Jamie raised his hand, bowed slightly, and spoke, saying what they might feel was against the ideals of chivalry, but the orcs did not deserve their nobility. He turned and walked on, inviting them to follow him, and declared that he had something else he wanted to show them. What they had just encountered was just a simulation, and he explained that far worse things had happened in the orc camps. After a short walk, the squad stopped in front of another basement, and Jamie turned to Yuri, saying that what they were about to see was the result of those very horrors. Yuri's expression turned serious as one of the soldiers gasped in shock and asked what exactly they were looking at. They were half-orcs. Yuri frowned as he looked at them and noticed that there were more of them than he expected. Jamie confirmed this, adding that their creation was far from a simple process. While Simon, standing nearby, watched the spectacle in horror, Jamie explained that the orcs were capturing humans and treating them like toys, and what they saw now was the result of this so-called fun. And then Yuri directly asked Jamie if he hated orcs. Jamie's gaze changed, and his tone became hard with hatred as he confirmed this, declaring that he would hate them for the rest of his days. Yuri watched Jamie silently with an unreadable expression on his face. Then he touched the sword at his belt, noticing its calm in the face of horror. He reflected that everyone has an unforgivable enemy, and for him, That enemy was the Empire. For Jamie, these were clearly orcs, since Yuri had heard that he had once found the corpse of his son in an orc village. That image must still haunt him, just as Yuri himself could never erase the image of his kingdom's destruction from his memory. Soon morning came, and the sunlight flooded the castle. Yuri stood admiring the view when the denunciation arrived. Jamie arrived with Corey standing next to him, and Jamie said that Yuri should take Corey with him. Yuri recognized him and noted that it was Corey he saw yesterday in the basement, and Jamie confirmed this and introduced Corey by name. Yuri admitted that being able to speak the Orcish language was a valuable skill, and then Corey stepped forward excitedly, saying that he had something important to say. But Yuri raised his hand, ordering him to stop, and replied that he already knew everything. Yuri was confused by this statement, but Gigi handed him the glove and told him not to worry anymore, adding that he hoped that from now on, Corey would do his best. Corey held the thing in confusion and started to say something about its value, but Yuri interrupted him. He called Mr. Raymond and asked if the border was ahead. He cautiously confirmed it, warning of swarms of monsters, but assuring them there were no ambushes. However, Yuri smirked and disagreed, stating that the packs of monsters posed the same threat as the orcs. He made it clear that they must be exterminated. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, a group of people carrying supplies suddenly stopped. The sound of horse hooves was getting closer. Someone was approaching, and soon a group of cruelly grinning horsemen appeared in sight. One of them, holding a bloody sword in his hands, stood in front of the people, and the expression on his face was evil and merciless. Then he raised his sword and began to cut them out, so that blood flew in all directions. Elsewhere, Yuri's detachment continued to move through the forest, and Yuri looked back with a thoughtful expression on his face. He looked at Corey and thought about the problems that would arise if the party found out that he was a half-orc. He reassured himself that entrusting the matter to Corey Hernando was the right thing to do. He could handle it. Although, recalling the magician's confidence, he admitted that there might still be some trouble. Then he took out the map and studied it seriously, after which he waved his hand and called Gerald over, who immediately responded, riding up on horseback to meet Yuri. Yuri pointed to the map and tasked Gerald with reconnaissance, promising to mark the search area. Gerald grew nervous, hesitantly reminding him that the area was full of bandits. Frowning, he noted that the mere presence of the detachment would scare off the bandits, and asked if Yuri seriously planned to kill them all. Yuri calmly replied that they would have to hunt them anyway, since they were interfering with border trade. Then, with a teasing smile, Yuri asked if Gerald lacked self-confidence. Gerald fell silent, clearly stunned by his words. Yuri added that the soldiers were alarmed, and he himself was only an inexperienced prince. He acknowledged Gerald's talent in fencing, but noted that if he didn't catch the bandits, his skills would be useless. But before the prince could finish speaking, Gerald galloped off. He shouted that he'd be back soon, and Yuri grinned contentedly. He knew he could handle it. Raymond approached and noticed that Yuri was being kind to Gerald. Yuri playfully asked if it really looked that way and added that he just liked having him around. He then turned to Raymond with a reserved expression on his face, and in a thoughtful tone, asked if he could ask a simple, perhaps boring question. Raymond answered in the affirmative, and then Yuri asked him what he was fighting for. This question made Raymond fall silent for a moment, since he hadn't been asked about it for a long time. But in the end, he gave a standard answer, explaining that he was fighting for Briel's safety. Yuri looked at him silently and smiled, thinking that this was a worthy answer. And then, with a surge of energy, he ordered the others to continue their march. He announced that he was going to check on Gerald and quickly galloped off before Raymond could say anything else. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to a forest clearing where huts had been built. Several people were scattered around the area, and one tied man, lying on the ground, screamed loudly. Another man came closer and told him to shut up. Yuri appeared, his expression worried. Holding a knife, he warned the man not to do anything stupid if he valued his life. Gerald scanned the area with binoculars and reported that they had found what they were looking for. It was a robber's den, for which Yuri praised him, noting that he had done an excellent job. He then interrogated the man he had captured, asking if there was anyone nearby and if he was the only one patrolling. The man nodded quickly, confirming that it was true, while Yuri silently watched him, narrowing his eyes, when I noticed the glint of the necklace on his neck. He reached out and ripped the necklace off, startling the man, who screamed in panic. And Yuri, picking up the little thing, asked what it was and whether it belonged to him. The robber dryly replied that no, explaining that the leader had ordered them to wear it while patrolling. And hearing this, Yuri prepared to draw his sword, asking if this object was some kind of artifact, perhaps enchanted. The man, now frightened, insisted that he knew nothing, and Yuri stood coldly in front of him, declaring that in that case, there was no choice. Then he turned away and laughed, adding that he would just have to catch the leader and ask him directly. And by this time, the sky had already noticeably darkened. Hiding behind a tree, Yuri quietly watched the camp when Gerald, who had arrived, called out to him and reported that following Yuri's orders, they had stationed troops along the bandits' escape routes. He also reported that scouts had been sent out to assess their strength, to which Yuri smiled contentedly and asked if the rest of the squad would cope if he caused chaos. Gerald, confused, asked what the prince meant, but Yuri, without saying another word, mounted his horse, gave the signal to advance, and noted that if they were late, there would be no enemies left to fight. Gerald stood in shock as Yuri galloped away, shouting orders to attack, and the still stunned knight tried to stop him because it was dangerous to go further. But Yuri, in his excitement, galloped forward, leading the attack, and his voice, along with the clatter of hooves, echoed throughout the robbers' lair. Inside, the robbers heard a commotion and looked at each other in confusion. Asking what the noise was, another man carrying food looked worried. A moment later, Yuri, sword in hand, charged in on horseback, tearing through the group of bandits with force. And while they froze from shock and surprise, he addressed them with a smile and a sharp tone, calling them robbers. That evening, Gerald and the other soldiers arrived at the scene and were stunned by the sight they saw. Yuri sat calmly on the bound bandit and lit a fire. He greeted them, noticing that they were late. Gerald ran up and excitedly asked Yuri not to act alone anymore, and Gigi only replied that it would be better if they didn't lag behind him, and then asked Raymond about the escapees. The knight reported that they were finished off and there were no casualties on their side, to which Yuri, holding a skewer of meat in his hand, responded with delight. He suggested taking the bandits' meat and cook dinner, announcing that they would be having an outdoor barbecue tonight. Gerald eyed the meat skeptically and noticed it was completely fatty. Yuri smiled and said they didn't know how to enjoy food, and he still had a lot to learn. He then said that they would camp here for the night and resume their journey the next day. One of the robbers woke up. Raymond reminded Yuri that before reaching their allies in Balchan, they would head to Gid. He noted that they could encounter other armies there, as everyone was using the same road. Yuri quickened his pace and knocked out the bandit, asking which country exactly he was referring to, and Raymond replied that it was the Holy Nation. Yuri responded calmly, noting that this country was known for its holy magic, and added that if they turned out to be friendly, they would later be able to help with the treatment of their soldiers. Raymond, however, noted with doubt that friendliness was not at all guaranteed, explaining that he had heard that the commander of the Allied forces was the Princess of the Holy Nation. However, there were rumors that she was losing ground in the struggle for the throne and was desperately seeking military success to strengthen her claims, and no one can predict what she will do in this war. Prince Yuri Briol rested his chin on his hand thoughtfully, pondering the mention of the Princess of the Holy Kingdom. And, sensing his concern, Sir Raymond suggested exploring her past in more detail, but Yuri simply smiled and brushed it off, saying that he would soon meet her face to face, and he looked up at the night sky, remaining completely unperturbed. The scene changed. The Allied rallying point at Balshad required a stop in Gida, an independent city that supplied the troops with provisions. Being under a separate jurisdiction, Gida maintained strict neutrality. Yuri warned that any failure would be punished under martial law, and ordered Raymond to convey to everyone that discipline was not negotiable. He agreed without hesitation. Troops were stationed outside the city limits with tighter controls. Yuri then stated that he would meet Lord Yeda himself, and inside the estate, the Lord greeted him with a smile, expressing his respect for meeting the third Prince of Briel. Yuri thanked the Lord on Briel's behalf for his assistance, but the Lord brushed aside the formalities and assured Yuri that they would fully support the alliance. At the table, the Lord praised Yuri's father for his battles with the orcs, and joked that they were probably shaking with fear with the prince's arrival. Yuri laughed lightly, promising to live up to this reputation. Suddenly, a servant quietly approached the Lord and whispered something in his ear, after which the Lord informed Yuri that the Princess of the Holy Kingdom had just arrived and asked if he would like to meet her. Yuri immediately agreed, and soon after this, Princess Sibylla entered the room, accompanied by two knights. Her face was stern. Without a hint of warmth, she introduced herself by her title and ordered that she be called Sibyl Arsaint. The Lord stood up and greeted her as the second princess of the Holy Kingdom. She just looked coldly at Yuri and asked if he was one of the Lord's vassals, and before he could answer, she let him go, declaring that she had business with the Lord, and asked him to leave. The Lord, clearly taken by surprise, tried to clarify, but before he could finish, how one of the princess's knights shouted at Yuri, demanding to know how he could sit in front of a royal person and not get up. But Yuri, calm and amused by the situation, revealed his identity, announcing that he was the third prince of Briol, and the room immediately fell silent. Shock and confusion hung in the air, and the knights who had just been rude, they bowed hastily, showering the prince with apologies. Yuri turned everything into a joke, noting that it was his own fault since he dressed like a local tramp and not like a prince, which only increased their discomforts, and they began to bow and apologize even more. And later, over tea, Yuri jokingly asked the Lord if he really looked so shabby. The Lord smiled and replied that this was not so, and Princess Sibylla apologized for the misunderstanding and asked to leave it in the past. Yuri teased her again, but then greeted her properly, introducing himself and extending his hand for a handshake, and she shook it, answering politely. Then Yuri casually asked how old she was, and Sybil was surprised but replied that she was 20. He replied with a grin that he was 18, and that the difference of 2 years is a trifle, so they can quite easily throw aside formalities, to which the Lord laughed and remarked that it was useful to make friends in the face of fighting the orcs. He asked Sybil if she was against it, and she hesitantly agreed, and as soon as the formalities were over, Yuri asked Sibylla about her troops. He noted that he hadn't seen any detachments en route, and she confirmed that they would arrive tomorrow. Yuri thoughtfully rubbed his chin and expressed hope that nothing bad would happen. However, this remark irritated her. She sharply declared that there was no need to worry about the order and discipline of the Holy Kingdom, and asked if he was hinting at something. Gigi explained that he meant external threats, not internal ones, adding that orcs sometimes cross borders and can ambush without warning. The Lord nodded, agreeing that the orcs were surprisingly cunning for their size, and Yuri ended the conversation, saying that he was confident in the Holy Kingdom's ability to handle everything, but still advised Sibylla to remain on guard. Later, while walking around the city, Yuri was talking to Hernando, and when he asked him about the paladins, Yuri replied that they were too reserved, and perhaps Sibylla was bored with them. Hernando asked if he liked the princess, to which Yuri shrugged and replied that perhaps. He then pulled out the necklace he had taken from the bandits and asked Hernando if he was sure it was from these parts, to which the magician confirmed this, pointing out that such things are sold only in one place. Yuri asked if it was true that the necklace attracted orcs. Hernando replied that the bandit leader claimed that his aura drove the orcs into a frenzy, like a war drug. He added that it might be an artifact, but too crude to be effective. And while they were discussing it, the shop owner began to become noticeably irritated. He yelled at them to leave if they weren't buying anything, and they complied, concluding that the bandits might have bought up all the merchandise. Yuri, still smiling, remarked that it was annoying and shameful, when suddenly Hernando noticed something and attracted Yuri's attention. They saw soldiers from Briol entering a building that looked like a gambling den, and Hernando noted that gambling was in full swing there. Yuri's eyes lit up, and he said that if his people were gambling, he couldn't ignore it. As they approached the bar, Yuri remarked that they needed discipline, and Hernando agreed with him. In another part of the city, a knight of the Holy Kingdom asked Sybil whether she had met the Lord, and she answered in the affirmative. This knight, Vice Commander Finnick, mocked Yuri, saying that he could not believe that such an eccentric man was in charge, and that Briel's knightly glory had long since passed. But Sibylla warned him not to dare insult Briel, especially behind her back. He brushed off her concern, making fun of Yuri's outfit and demeanor while she stared at him, clearly expressing her displeasure. But Fennec persisted, declaring that he would not be surprised if after this campaign, Briel was missing one prince. Finally, Sybil ordered him to stop. He reluctantly gave in, sarcastically addressing her as Your Highness. She asked if the main forces were having any problems, to which he arrogantly stated that everything was fine and under control, after which he left, adding that they would patrol the city. Sybil sighed, her thoughts weighed down by doubts. And that evening, the town tavern was noisy, with conversations and drinks flowing everywhere. Finnick and his knights entered with stern expressions on their faces, and looking at what was happening with disgust, Finnick asked who these visitors were. One of the knights replied that they looked like Briel's soldiers, and Finnick mocked their lack of discipline, asking how they were even allowed in here. Another knight laughed, noting that their commander made it immediately clear why they were behaving this way. And Finnick said he would not tolerate this kind of behavior. He would not just sit and watch it. The hysteric man raised his voice and began to scold the soldiers for gambling, questioning their loyalty to the Allied forces. And when they turned calmly, still holding the cards in their hands, He continued to rant until someone's hand tapped him on the shoulder. He turned around and froze in shock. It was Prince Yuri. Smiling and still holding his hand on Finnick's shoulder, Yuri asked his name. Finnick's face twisted in anger. He waved Yuri's hand away and barked that such dissolute behavior was an insult to the leadership. The soldiers watched in shock, while Finnick mocked them too, saying that they had no place on the battlefield since they were clinging to the cards like children. Yuri's smile was replaced by a cold look, and he demanded to know why a simple question was met with such disrespect. He wondered if there was any structure or ranks in the Holy Kingdom, and Finnick tried to compose himself. But before he could speak, the door swung open. Princess Sibylla entered. She asked what was going on here, and when she saw Finnick, she frowned and reminded him that he was supposed to be on patrol. Instantly, all of Finnick's arrogance evaporated, and he bowed apologetically. Sibylla, unimpressed, ordered him to wait outside, and he obeyed, being furious and feeling humiliated. The girl looked angrily after the soldier, who had forgotten where his place was. She turned back to Yuri and apologized on behalf of Finnick, but Yuri only smiled and said that it wasn't necessary. With a hint of sarcasm, he added, "Unless she's a holy ruler, it's foolish to expect her to control every single one of her subordinates." After these words, her hand instinctively went to the hilt of her sword. She studied him closely, then nodded and turned to leave. But before leaving, she told him that she would repay this debt another time. Yuri watched her go and replied that he would take her at her word, but then his face noticeably darkened. Raymond's words echoed in his mind. The princess was in a precarious position in the struggle for the throne, and desperately needed military success. Now he understood everything, but nevertheless, Yuri shrugged his shoulders, muttering that it was not his concern. Yuri returned to the soldiers. They were waiting for his turn, laughing. He laughed heartily and told the eager soldier that he appreciated their confidence. Meanwhile, tension was brewing elsewhere. Sir Finnick stood tensely with his knights as the princess approached them. Disappointed, he demanded an answer from her, whether she had already managed to become friends with the third Prince of Briol. But she asked if it was a big problem. Finnick snapped back, ranting about the prince's rudeness. But before he could say anything else, a panicked voice cut through the air, causing both him and the princess to turn towards the source of the noise. A soldier on a bloody horse was approaching them, whose armor was dented and stained with dirt. He dismounted, dropped to one knee, and apologized for his appearance before delivering the grim news. The main forces of the Holy Kingdom were ambushed by orcs, which is why the princess's face turned pale, but instantly became determined. She dressed in full battle armor, and with swift determination, she mounted her horse, and Lord Hida, deeply troubled, asked if she was really leaving right now. And before she could gallop away, he cautiously suggested asking for support from Briol's army. The girl's face became sad, and she looked away, and the Lord emphasized that it's not about pride, but about protecting allied troops. This is the best way to protect people. Finnick flared up again, snorting that the kingdom didn't need help. He asked if the Lord really believed their knights could fall to some orcs. The Lord tried to smooth things over, but the princess calmly interrupted him. She assured the Lord that she appreciated his concern, but she would handle everything herself. And with these words, she called her knights to the attack, after which the detachment raced away to the sound of hooves fading away in the distance. The Lord, having watched them for a long time, sighed heavily, and one of his soldiers remarked on how stubborn the people of the Holy Kingdom were, especially this Finnick. The Lord agreed, and without delay ordered the soldier to ride to Briol's camp to ask Prince Yuri for help, after which the soldier saluted and quickly galloped away. In the camp, Yuri received this message, and after reading the letter, concern was reflected on his face. When Sir Raymond asked what had happened, Yuri quickly read and explained to him that the main forces of the Holy Kingdom were under attack, and Lord Guido was asking for their help. To which Raymond asked why the request was coming from the guide and not from the Holy Kingdom itself. Yuri replied dryly, mentally picturing Finnick's face, and noting that someone had probably been too stubborn to ask in person, after which he ordered Raymond to prepare for mobilization. Raymond accepted the order, and Yuri turned to the messenger and asked his name. The soldier, breathlessly, replied that his name was Roy, and Yuri instructed him to go to the bar near the Talisman Market and call the Knights of Briol, ordering him to convey that the prince would only receive the first 10 people who showed up. Roy nodded quickly and rushed off, raising a cloud of dust, and Yuri put the letter on the table, brushed the dust off his hands, and muttered with a grin that it was time for a night walk. Later that night, Yuri rode with his knights to the designated place, and on the way he turned to them, mockingly asking if they still felt tipsy. The knights shouted back proudly, raising their swords, and seeing their energy, Yuri laughed again. He turned to the pale, haggard Gerald and made fun of his terrible appearance. He muttered that everything was fine, though his expression showed otherwise. Then Laurent galloped up to Yuri, literally beaming with enthusiasm, and called out to the prince, praising him for his kindness and restraint towards the paladins of the Holy Kingdom. He added that Yuri demonstrated great leadership qualities, proving that true dignity does not require stooping to the pettiness of others, to which Yuri laughed awkwardly, not knowing how to react to Laurent's passionate admiration. Yuri was surprised to himself when Laurent became so devoted, unlike in his past life, but he admitted that he himself had changed in many ways. Laurent, his eyes shining, thanked the prince for acknowledging his loyalty, and Yuri nodded to him, still trying to come to terms with this new version of Laurent. As they rode on, Sir Raymond called out to the others, noticing something ahead, and upon closer inspection, they confirmed that they were indeed paladins of the Holy Kingdom. Before entering the battle, Yuri addressed his knights in a firm voice, reminding them that this would be their first battle against the orcs. He declared that he would be the first to set foot on the battlefield and the last to leave it, and as he spoke, his body shimmered with a luminous blue aura, pulsating power and calm majesty. He surveyed his troops and gave one final order, telling them not to die. He then gripped the reins tightly, his horse letting out a loud neigh. His voice rose above the thunder of hooves as he shouted the order to charge. Some time ago, the battlefield was seething with chaos as the holy knights rushed forward. The princess, her heart pounding beneath her armor, cursed herself for being so careless. She silently admitted she should have expected an ambush. Yuri's earlier warning echoed in her head, and she thought gloomily that ignoring him was a mistake she could not afford. Ahead, in the fog of battle, shadows moved furiously. As she approached, the dark shapes took on clearer outlines. Her knights, locked in battle, surrounded each orc with a multitude of blades. Relief washed over her for a moment when she saw that the Holy Kingdom's flag was still flying. She turned to Sir Fennec and told him that they were heading straight for the enemy commander. He responded in agreement and immediately shouted out an order to the formation to go on the assault. The Holy Knights roared in response, raising their weapons high and charging forward. The princess clutched her cross tightly, her voice trembling as she whispered a prayer, begging the Lord for strength and admitting that they were afraid. Her horse began to glow with a soft white light. She raised her sword and ordered the advance to be accelerated. As they rode, they passed a skull embedded in the ground, covered in aura and rope. As they approached, the skull rose into the air, its eye sockets glowing ominously red, emitting a malevolent purple aura. Suddenly, a magic circle flared up brightly and ominously under the hooves of their horses. The ground beneath them collapsed. There was no time to react. One by one, the riders fell into the darkness. The princess realized too late that they had walked right into a trap. Her body rolled head over heels, her armor scraping against the rocks and ground. Doubts plagued her thoughts. Had she made the wrong choice again? Her thoughts drifted into the past, and her eyes closed, trying to hide from the bright light. She recalled the moment from childhood when she first received her sacred powers. Praise surrounded her, warm, proud voices calling her amazing. Determined to prove herself worthy, she also took up swordsmanship. But through these thoughts came a sharp memory of her sword clashing with her older brother's sword, and she remembered the day she broke his blade. In that moment, she realized that trying to combine holiness and martial valor had been her greatest mistake. Her brother, feeling his claim to the throne threatened, sent her to the battlefield. He spoke of divine will and how the battle here would cleanse her soul. Now she knew it was a lie. Lying on her back, covered in bruises and in complete pain, she hissed that it was all bullshit. Now, lying at the bottom of the pit, she knew that he simply wanted her dead. Around her, wounded soldiers struggled to get to their feet. She barely managed to get up and gave the order to concentrate. But then, looking at her armor and sword, she noticed a slippery black liquid stuck to them. Her face turned deathly pale. It was oil. She looked up to see orcs surrounding them with flaming torches. One of them raised his torch high, and the light of its flame flared up in the girl's eyes, while the monster himself looked contentedly at the people who had fallen into his trap. Her thoughts whirled. Ambush, traps, fire. What could she even do now, and how was she supposed to survive this? Overwhelmed with terror, she wondered why she had endured everything up to this point, only for it to end like this. Then a voice called out to her. She opened her eyes just in time to see the cleanly severed head of an orc fly through the air. The voice came again, mockingly asking if it was really so hard to just ask for help. There stood Yuri with a torch in his hand, casually wiping blood from the blade of his sword. He smiled as he looked at the bottom of the trap and asked if it was okay. When the area was cleared, he threw her a rope, and she, taking it, climbed up. After climbing out of the hole, she looked at him and said that she was now in his debt, and he replied that it was nothing. Before they could continue the conversation, a soldier ran up. It was one of her own knights. Second-in-command Finnick stepped forward, his arrogance replaced by a steely composure, and bowed deeply to Yuri. He formally greeted Third Prince Briol. He offered a sincere apology for the recent incident at the bar and solemnly added that he would not forget this favor. Even the princess was perplexed. Was Finnick really apologizing? Yuri looked him over calmly. After a pause, he nodded and accepted the apology. He then added that if Briol ever needed help, he hoped the Holy Kingdom would reciprocate. A scream was heard nearby. Yuri turned his head sharply toward the sound. A huge orc came out onto the battlefield. He stood perfectly still and blew his horn, and Yuri's grip on the sword tightened. But then he noticed movement. The orcs were retreating. He wondered aloud if they were fleeing after failing to kill the holy knights. Gigi did not hesitate and shouted to his people to pursue the orcs, ordering them not to let a single one of them escape. The soldiers roared in agreement and rushed forward, filling the air with their battle cries. However, during the chase, Yuri noticed something that made him slow down slightly. In the distance, an orc stood at full height, holding a distinctive banner. Yuri's eyes narrowed. He instantly recognized Orc Wade, the very one his mentor had warned him about. The princess called out his name in confusion, but he motioned for her to stay behind. The orc Vale calmly raised his bow and knocked an arrow crackling with dark energy, and with all his demonic power, he released her. A moment later, she was already a couple of meters away from the main character. Yuri's eyes immediately narrowed in focus, and in a split second he drew his sword, cutting the arrow in half on the fly. He smirked and noticed that the enemy commander seemed to be angry with him, and raising his sword and shrugging his shoulders, he added that he would probably have to swallow this bait. With a weak smile, he raised his sword, channeling mana into its steel, and said that he should answer the orc's challenge properly. His body glowed with a bright aura as he prepared himself. Watching as the orcs hesitated and retreated back, he stepped forward, each step measured and confident. Once he was at a sufficient distance, he assumed a firm stance, declaring that he would return soon. Princess Sibylla of the Holy Kingdom cried out in alarm that he should not go alone, but Yuri paid no attention. Exploding with speed, he charged. The orcs, seeing him approach, scattered. One of them, however, stood firm, his spear at the ready. The orc growled something in his guttural tongue, and then he hurled the weapon with all the force he could muster. The spear cut through the air like lightning. Yuri saw him, but didn't slow down. He lowered his blade to his side, keeping his eyes on the oncoming blow. The spear was getting closer, and now it was only inches from his face. In that moment, a memory struck him. Bernard's lesson on severing one's soul. In this memoir, Bernard explained with all seriousness that everything changes on the battlefield, the terrain, the weather, and thousands of other factors. He asserted that the only reliable way to endure is to train the body. And yet, he added, the prince's gift of soul severing is unique. He explained to Yuri that he perceives all variables simultaneously, instinctively choosing the ideal response, and then transforms that instinct into a blade. Yuri remembered asking Bernard to explain it more clearly. Bernard sighed and simply replied that, when the time came, the prince will understand everything without words, and his body will simply begin to move. Just like in the present, Yuri shifted to the side just as much as needed. The spear whistled past his face, missing it by a hair. His eyes immediately caught sight of another spear flying at great speed straight towards him. He crouched low, ready, and just as it approached, he jumped up sharply. The weapon crashed into the ground right under where he had just been standing. Landing on the shaft stuck in the mud, he used it as a fulcrum and soared high into the air. The orcs below stood frozen in stupor for a moment, and at that very moment, Yuri fell upon them. His sword described a single arc, fast and merciless. More screams came from behind. 3 huge orcs rushed forward, their eyes blazing with rage. Yuri studied them, thinking that going head-on with 3 against 1 would be reckless. Nevertheless, a thrill of excitement flickered within him. He said it had been too long since he had stood on the battlefield, and he refused to miss this chance. He assumed a stable position, transitioning into the stance from his past life. His gaze sharpened, and in that instant, the world changed. He whispered that he saw it. Lines drawn across the orcs' bodies, threads of weakness, paths for his sword. Following these lines, he laid the first one down before he realized the coming of death, and then the second and last. His blows followed the threads flawlessly, depriving the enemy of even a second to counterattack. The clash turned into a one-sided massacre, leaving behind only pools of blood. As he sheathed the blade, he muttered that his body still lagged behind his thoughts, but he had resigned himself to it for now. Among the corpses, his gaze fell on a spear. He picked it up, holding it high. He shouted out the Orc Vale's name, challenging the commander to a fight. The Orc Vale froze and turned, its presence radiating menace. Yuri gripped the spear tightly and poured mana into it, and threw it like a storm. The Orc Vale refused to budge, determined to show off his strength and choosing to block the blow with his axes. Yuri's grin widened as the spear struck its target, but not the Orc Vale himself. Instead, it shattered the long pole tied to his back, the banner of his command. The fragments scattered like rain. The surrounding orcs gasped, unable to believe their eyes. The Orc Vale bared its teeth, gnashing its teeth, and let out a low, furious growl. His banner had disappeared, and only a broken pole remained behind him. He growled something harsh in his tongue, an order that forced his warriors to retreat. Yuri watched them go, thinking that he had expected them to attack instead. Apparently, the Orc Vale preferred to conserve its strength rather than waste it. Yuri grinned and remarked that this should be enough payment for the previous arrow. Just then, Princess Sibylla ran up to him, calling his name. Out of breath, she asked if he was hurt. He responded with a bright smile, assuring her that he was perfectly fine. They turned together, watching the enemy retreat. Yuri then noted that the battle seemed to be over and asked Sibylla how it felt to achieve her first victory with the Allied forces. For a moment, she was speechless, and her lips stretched into a smile. She bowed her head in gratitude, saying that it was all thanks to him, and he accepted these words with quiet ease. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, the Orc Vale trembled with rage. He punched the tree, splintering the bark. The other orcs froze behind him as he muttered something cold and poisonous through his teeth. His fangs were bared, his monstrous features were twisted, and his single eye glowed crimson as his anger spread around him like a storm. That night in the town of Gid, soldiers gathered in a tavern. Some sat outside and drank, while inside, the hall was bustling with knights and retainers, drowning themselves in ale. Sir Jared was in the very center, recounting the battle in the forest. He claimed the prince rushed forward and even intercepted the torch thrown into the pit, describing the moment with sweeping hand movements. The men listened in awe. One soldier remarked that, according to rumors, Yuri was useless and was just a gambler living on his winnings. Although, it must be admitted, he was skilled at cards. Laurent, a knight who fought alongside Yuri, flushed with indignation. He declared such slander to be sheer nonsense. Pressing his hand to his chest, he began to assert that the royal blood shines brightest in Yuri. He began passionately recounting the prince's exploits, promising to recount each one in detail. A hooded figure watched silently from the corner, devouring his food. Yuri's personal assassin. She listened, thinking the prince was too remarkable a man to be a mere member of the royal family. She noted to herself that he had even figured out the assassination technique, which she had hidden all her life. Now he strode alone onto the battlefield, as if he were ahead of fate itself. Sometimes, she mused, it seemed as if he knew the future. She called the innkeeper, telling him that he was looking for a man with dark brown hair, a sword on his belt, and extraordinary skills. The innkeeper frowned, replying that he could not recall such a person from so few details. She added another clue. He speaks Continental poorly and with a noticeable accent. At these words, the innkeeper nodded and remembered the man, who ordered risotto without spices and asked for directions to Balshad. The woman rewarded him with a silver coin, thanking him for his help. He chuckled, declaring that he had not expected payment, although he accepted it with pleasure. She turned back to the window, muttering that Balshad was the assembly point for the Allied forces. The man she was looking for was heading in the same direction as the prince. She had to move quickly to find him. An image surfaced in her mind. His back, his sword, his stance. She recognized him. He was one of the 10 strongest swordsmen on the continent, a warrior from the east. Meanwhile, after the clash in the forest, Prince Yuri and his men moved on to their next target. Along the way, they camped every night, now much better prepared than before. The prince surveyed their work and remarked to Sir Raymond that the men seemed accustomed to the established order. He had been worried he'd have to explain everything from scratch. Sir Raymond responded with satisfaction that after so many nights of training, their bodies were moving instinctively. Yuri praised him for his efforts, noting that he deserved the credit. Pointing ahead, Yuri announced that he would go scout the area and leave the rest to Sir Raymond. The knight bowed in agreement. Sometime later, the prince stood alone in the canopy of the forest. He looked around the dim undergrowth and noticed that the silence seemed unnatural for a place filled with people. Having come to the conclusion that the likelihood of an ambush by the knights was higher than he had initially assumed, then a sharp cry, someone growling that the target was a little bastard, cut through the silence and drew his attention to the source of the sound. From the bushes, he saw soldiers surrounding Corey, the boy kneeling, the men looming over him. One of them barked that he'd warned him not to move out of sight and asked if he'd ignored the order. Corey didn't answer, tears streaming down his cheeks as they hurled insults at him, calling him a filthy half-orc. Another muttered that he suspected Corey of being a spy, deceiving His Highness for some secret mission. Corey, trembling, protested that the accusation was false, declaring that he would never have dared to commit such a betrayal, and repeating that it was not true. The soldier clamped his hand around Corey's wrist and snapped that these denials were nonsense. He tore off the glove the prince had given him, claiming that Corey had most likely stolen that too. Corey lunged for it, pleading that he hadn't stolen anything, and asking for it back. The man refused and declared that he would break it right there on the spot. His friend laughed as the prince emerged from behind the leafy shelter. He called out to the men, demanding to know why they were bothering others while the others were setting up camp. They stuttered, making excuses that His Highness should understand. However, the prince cut off their excuses with a chilling look. He said that they seemed slow on the uptake, so he would kindly repeat it again for them to leave. The soldiers stood at attention, shouted that they understood everything, and threw down the gauntlet, and they ran away, shrilly begging for forgiveness as they went. Yuri turned to Corey and asked if he was okay. Corey just looked at him in shock, after which he picked up the glove and, with his eyes closed, pressed it to his chest. In a quiet but firm voice, he replied that he was fine and thanked His Highness. The prince sat down next to him and asked if he should formally punish those people. With a weak smile, Corey replied that there was no need. Adjusting his hood, he added that such an attitude was almost inevitable, since people valued what was beautiful and despised what was ugly. He continued that if the prince protected him, he would feel comfortable for a while, but that comfort would only take him further from his dream. The prince asked what dream he had in mind. Corey hesitated, then admitted that he wanted to live among ordinary people and earn their recognition. The answer surprised Yuri, who thought that such a wish would be difficult to fulfill. He reasoned that for now, Corey could remain in service as an orcish translator, but as soon as this raid was over, his thought was cut off when he simply raised his hand and stroked Corey's head, causing the boy to widen his eyes in surprise. He asked if Corey was currently assigned to Hernando, and Corey said yes. Then Yuri gave a quiet command that shocked the boy even more. He told Corey to learn magic from Hernando. With an encouraging grin, he added that in order to live openly among people, Corey would need unique, unparalleled skills. Night fell under a clear sky. Briol's soldiers finished setting up the camp, and all actions were carried out smoothly and as usual. A council gathered in a lamp-lit tent. Someone asked how far preparations for the night assault had progressed. Sir Raymond reported that all the warehouses were covered with fireproof cloth, and that sentries had surrounded the palisades and barracks. Jared asked skeptically whether such measures were really necessary, noting that the prince had allocated more men than usual. In response, the prince pointed to a position on the map and said they were operating deep within orc territory. Nothing would be surprising if something happened that night. He added that the enemy could repeat the arson tactics used against the Holy Kingdom in the previous clash. As if summoned by this warning, a soldier burst into the tent, out of breath and pale. He announced the breaking news that the orcs had launched an attack. The tension in the tent reached breaking point. All the council members immediately ran outside into the night. Tongues of flame pierced the palisade stakes. The men grappled with the shadowy figures and the roar of smoke and steel. The prince reasoned aloud that the situation was worse than expected. A barrel, leaving a trail of dark energy, arced over the brawl and crashed down behind him with a roar. The explosion shook the earth and turned the air into scorching heat. Looking around at the raging fire, he sighed, admitting he was speechless, and asked if the orcs had mastered gunpowder. Hernando replied that it wasn't gunpowder at all, but rather the explosion reeked of twisted mana. Magic. The prince remarked that such impudence was astounding, adding that he found it all tiresome. Nevertheless, he demanded countermeasures. Hernando, having studied the flashes and flows of mana, concluded that the enemy was likely hurling pre-prepared magical bombs. He said the only way out was to stop the throwers. Yuri thought about it. He then called out sharply to Jared and Sir Raymond, barking orders. He told them to split up and take command of their respective squads. He filled the blade with blue mana and added that in the meantime he would go and meet with the architect of this spectacle, allowing the radiance to spread through his limbs until he himself was cloaked in azure light. He asked Hernando which direction the magic was coming from. Hernando held out his hand and said that the source was in that direction. The prince stamped his foot once, causing the ground to rumble under his heel, and said that he would return. He lunged forward on the shock wave of his stomp, rushing through the smoke and heat like an explosion. When he reached the source, a look of disbelief crossed his face. Before him stood the same orc veil with the banner retied to his back, the same one he had humiliated earlier. Rage quickened his steps. He charged into battle, driven by this rage. The orc veil remained motionless, and his gaze still seemed carved from stone. This defiant calm spurred him on even more. Gigi shouted the creature's name in a voice full of hatred and rushed forward, demanding to know if this was the creature that had caused all the chaos. The lunge flew forward, but the orc veil's hand jerked back, and his fingers gripped the axe tightly. With a speed beyond all expectations, the dull blade shot up to meet the blade. Steel met steel, and a shower of sparks erupted. The orc veil turned the clash into a wide horizontal slash that sent both combatants flying apart. Yuri slid across the ground, his breathing ragged and his fingers trembling as the realization of the orc veil's primal power sent a chill through him. He noticed the glint in his eyes and recognized the veteran's bearing hidden in every movement. This opponent was no ordinary one, and his axe rose again. Yuri quickly calculated everything and decided that he needed to increase the distance, even though he didn't like giving up ground. The next blow came with a roar, and he missed it by a hair. The blows rained down in a continuous stream, and he refused to take any of them head-on. Tired of this dance, the orc veil gathered his strength for another sweeping slash. This time there was no way to avoid it. Yuri adjusted his stance, channeled his mana, and stopped the swing with a growl that broke through his clenched teeth. He wasn't just holding it back. He converted the force of the blow into a counterattack and delivered a horizontal strike of his own. The impact sparked a white light, and both opponents recoiled again. The boy studied the orc veil with a new respect bordering on caution, and internally recognized that this opponent was on a completely different level. He said that if that was the case, they would test each other properly. With these words, he enveloped himself in mana, until it shone like a comet and rushed forward, turning the sword into a blue blade of death. The orc veil responded in kind, his body and axe becoming enveloped in dark purple energy. He struck first, describing a brutal arc, but Yuri jumped over him as the blade hummed through empty air. The boy landed sliding along the ground, and the momentum pulled him close. When he raised his head, shock was reflected on his face. The orc veil controlled mana with astonishing skill, indicating that he had learned a formal method of manipulating it. Step by step, this bulky figure advanced, shrouded in an ominous purple haze, with a furious gaze and an inexorable gait. Yuri stood firmly in place. Curiosity and caution were closely intertwined within him, and he admitted that he should have realized this back then, when he heard that the enemy was using magic. He remembered asking if the orcs used gunpowder, and hearing Hernando's reply that the explosions were corrupted mana. If orc shamans master mana, then orc warriors can also adopt this method. A sincere smile, radiant with dangerous delight, touched his lips. He said that this makes the enemy elite. He intensified his aura to a harsh blue glow and thrust his sword forward, and narrowed his focus until his perception penetrated to the very depths. He activated the soul severing, and the world was divided into lines, bright trajectories drawn across the bodies of the orc veil, where every stroke called for a blow. The orc veil struck first, his axe a blur, destined to cleave the prince in two. Yuri ducked under the blow with practiced calculation, rising with his eyes ablaze with focused mana. A smoky glint rippled across his sword as it moved with incredible speed, and he thought the breach in the defense was his now. The metal met flesh sharply and decisively, and he plunged the tip into the creature's throat. But the orc veil didn't fall. He grabbed the stuck blade with a hand slippery with blood. His gaze burned with a furious dark red light, and he gripped the steel tightly, preventing Yuri from moving. He tensed and tried to drive the sword deeper, but the blade wouldn't budge. With a cold shudder, he realized the creature had flooded his throat with mana to soften the blow. The creature burst into mocking laughter, still choking on his blade. and raised her axe high to cut down the prince while he was chained. Yuri twisted, and the blade sank into the orc's palm. He jerked the weapon towards himself. The sword cut through his knuckles, and they fell off. The grip loosened, and the steel was released. The orc Vale howled, but did not retreat. He shifted the axe to his other hand and delivered a wild, deadly, arcing blow that nearly took Yuri's head off. He dodged a moment too late and noticed a thin streak of blood seeping down his shoulder from the blade that had whizzed past. Gigi ignored the burning sensation and allowed a confident smile to appear on his face, deciding that a run-of-the-mill attack would never crush this enemy. Yuri said that if that's the case, they'll fight in earnest. He assumed a forward-leaning stance, holding the blade low and preparing to lunge for acceleration. And opposite him, the orc Vale also crouched, his dark mana pulsing as he prepared for a brutal charge. They rushed towards each other, a blue comet against a purple meteor, and their auras collided in a riot of color. The impact detonated with a deafening roar, creating a crater and flooding the night with blinding light. When the smoke cleared, a lone silhouette appeared before my eyes, shrouded in a fading purple haze. A jagged fragment of a broken axe stuck out of the ground. Yuri Briel turned his gaze to the orc Vale. When he fell to his knees, completely exhausted, he stepped forward without hesitation, raising his sword for the final blow, and said that it was all over. He thrust the blade down. The blow pierced the flesh, and blood sprayed like a fan across the dug-up earth. The orc Vale fell flat, and Yuri was on top of it for a moment. Before stepping aside, his heel darkened with dried blood. He wrenched the sword free, and another splash of blood followed the steel. The creature's limbs trembled, signaling the fading spark of life. He studied this trembling, and a new calculation matured in his head. He decided that the elite must possess important knowledge, and considered it wasteful to cut off this knowledge here. While he was wiping a streak of blood from his cheek, knights ran up to him, their voices tense with anxiety. Sir Raymond asked if he was wounded. Jared stuttered at what he saw, calling the orc Vale by name in disbelief. Yuri replied that he was fine and immediately asked about the state of the camp. Sir Raymond reported that most of the enemy had already been destroyed. Relief eased the prince's shoulders. He said that was good, then ordered Raymond to gather the surviving orcs and bring the orc Vale back with him. He looked at the fallen creature with cold contempt and added that from now on they would begin a thorough study of their enemies. The camp was in motion. Braziers flared in the darkness as the squads reformed their ranks. A platform was set up for the prince. Hernando stood behind him, examining the cut on his shoulder. He advised him to stretch his arm to avoid long-term consequences. The green light healed the wound. The prince muttered that there was no time for nitpicking, as it was the result of a recent battle. Hernando chuckled. Even the orcs had made him sweat. Yuri's eyes narrowed, and he began to respond with a low growl. But the healing light faded before the argument could escalate. Hernando stepped back and said the treatment was complete, adding with obvious relief that it was nothing serious. Yuri gave one satisfied pat on the shoulder and said okay, but then paused when Hernando raised his hand. Clapping his hands loudly twice, Hernando called the soldiers and told them to bring something. Two men dragged a heavy object and dropped it on the ground with a dull thud, a field commander's chair designed to convey majesty. Hernando proudly presented it, and said that the interrogation would take place while the prince sat in all his majesty, noting that a carpenter from their ranks quickly coped with this idea. A look of surprise flashed across Yuri's face, but he pulled himself together. He allowed himself a faint smile and said that since it had already been done, it would be impolite to refuse. He settled into the seat, finding it disconcertingly comfortable, and admitted under his breath that it was not bad at all, while Hernando stood behind him with a satisfied look. The prince's expression became stern. He straightened up, raised his hand, and announced that the interrogation was beginning. So the guy ordered his men to bring in the prisoners one by one. Briel's knight pulled the orc forward and plunged his head into a cauldron of fire. A scream pierced the knight's silence. When the knight pulled his head back, the orc's face was a blistered mask, after which the body went limp and gave up the ghost. Fear gripped the line of captives. Yuri noted their horror and said in an icy voice that each would have only one chance to answer honestly. He asked who gave the order to ambush the knights. One of the orcs spat out a furious reply. Corey stepped forward to translate, but Yuri raised his hand and said that he already understood that it was just an insult. Then he waved his brush. Jared stepped forward with an expression colder than steel. grabbed the rope around the orc's neck, and dragged the intruder toward the fire, and plunged his head into the flames until the screams stopped. Panic distorted the remaining faces. Even Hernando and Cory stood stunned, speechless at the sheer efficiency. The imperturbable prince repeated that he would ask only once. A dagger of water attribute mana rose up from his sign and hovered above him, spinning slowly. He promised that mercy would be swift if the answers were clear. The blade, at his will, spiraled downward and pierced the smoking corpse, extinguishing the last tongues of flame. A terrible act of kindness. Jared's eyes widened in shock at the sight. Yuri ordered him to drag the body aside. Another orc blurted out something in his language, and the prince, looking at him, asked Cory what exactly had been said. Cory replied that these prisoners were ordinary soldiers and that they knew nothing. Pointing at the bound orc, he stuck out his tongue contemptuously and continued. Cory took this to mean the order came from that monster, Orkwall, and begged for mercy, punishing the orc in his place. The orc froze in betrayal. Yuri laughed briefly, noting that he appreciated the effort. He walked up close to the elite warrior and looked straight into his eyes, asked if the attack had been carried out on Orkva's orders. This game suddenly broke into the ensuing silence. Briol's soldiers exchanged puzzled glances, whispering among themselves that they had never heard of anything like this. The prince ignored them, thinking of Orkva, the orc king who had created this alliance. In his past life, this butcher had destroyed countless knights. He was once again convinced that this was an enemy that must be wiped off the face of the earth at any cost. Cory approached and conveyed that the vile orc begged for leniency if he answered honestly. Yuri replied that he gave his word. Yuri conveyed this, and a wave of calm swept through the circle. A moment later, Cory turned around, his face white with fear, and announced that the vile orc demanded an oath. Yuri's eyes widened. Cory explained what the creature was talking about, that breaking an oath is considered a disgrace that destroys honor to the ground. The prince's interest was piqued even further. He called the idea intriguing. That an orc who worshipped strength could speak the language of honor was astonishing, and then the prince solemnly declared that he would take the oath. Jared protested in a raised voice. Asking what would happen if this were followed by the release of the prisoner, the prince replied that they would sort it out and told him to calm down. He returned to the prisoner and asked again about Orkwa. Cory confirmed that the order had been conveyed by the leader of the vile orc tribe, having received instructions from the king himself. The prince asked how the enemy knew the allies' route. Cory reported that, according to the vile orc, Orkva has its own way, although the creature itself does not know it. Jared raised his hand to intervene, saying that this meant Orkva had found out their route and was setting up an ambush. The prince agreed with a tired sigh, adding that the disaster in the Holy Kingdom most likely followed the same pattern. He asked the last question. What is the measure of Orkva's power? The vile orc stared at him and then bared his teeth, and that expression turned into a manic laugh. He croaked out a response that made Cory shudder. He stuttered that even a dozen of such elite warriors would be nothing in front of Orkwa, and, shuddering, added, "The vile orc swears that Orkwa is more ferocious and stronger than any living creature." The soldiers' nerves began to fail. The prince noticed this and addressed them, saying that Orkwa might be a formidable opponent, but knowing this fact was already strength. He put his hand in his pocket and told the prisoner that people were much more vicious and cunning than he imagined. Taking out the artifact, he allowed its glow to play before the orc's eyes, while a sinister smile twisted his mouth. He repeated that humans were superior to this creature in malice and cunning. The orc thrashed in his bonds, and a line of soldiers cried out that he was breaking free, while the steel left its scabbard with a soft, ringing sound. The vile orc stamped his feet, searching for support and tearing at his shackles, and rushed forward with his fist raised. Someone shouted for him to stop. Yuri only watched with a fox-like grin as the knights rushed to intercept. Laurent was among them, his blade poised at the ready, his gaze frosty cold. The prince said, almost regretfully, that the prisoner spoke of honor, but proved himself unworthy of it. The orc froze, realizing that any movement now meant death. The prince turned away and ordered the creature to be killed. Laurent responded without hesitation, his sword cutting a crimson streak across the creature's chest. The prince continued on, his gaze stern, never once turning back as the three blades finished the job, spilling the orc's blood into the dust. Night fell upon the camp, the lanterns flickering as the tent canvas glowed from within. In the infirmary, rows of beds cradled men who tossed and turned, their chests tightly bandaged and their breathing ragged. The exhausted orderly begged him to hold on. His shift was almost over. A panicked cry came from the corner for the priest to examine the patient there, too. The white priest turned calmly and promised to come immediately. It was Jermaine, priest of Briol. The healer pointed to the next bed and asked the priest to attend to the case. Jermaine replied that he would take care of the patient and moved closer. A grateful Corey slipped inside, clutching a bucket of water in both hands, and reported that he had brought what was requested. Jermaine praised Corey and ordered him to step back. He lowered the pitcher into the brass basin and began to chant. Particles of light unfurled in the gloom. A golden glow pooled on his shoulders and spilled out like a curtain around the bowl. Corey winced at the sudden heatless flash and thought that just a few moments ago he had collected ordinary water. To the sound of a measured muttering, the surface of the basin began to ripple and then light up from within. Jermaine finished the verse, picked up the basin, and told Corey to use the water to wash the wound, as it was now holy water that would wash away the poison. Corey accepted the cup. Another cry came from the next bed, a desperate plea for help. Jermaine replied that he was already on his way and walked away smoothly. Waving his sleeves through the lamp smoke, he washed the soldier's wound with holy water. The man's convulsed face relaxed, and his breathing became even and deeper. Corey watched the shimmer color the canvas wall and whispered to himself that it was amazing. Wherever the priest's magic touched, the stony faces softened. Corey, his eyes wide, gasped, "This must be real magic." The dawn painted the mountains in purple and pink tones. Outside the supply tent, the worst chaos had subsided. Hernando noted that things seemed to have calmed down a bit. The priest thanked him for his assistance and said that Duke Hernando's efforts had been a blessing. Hernando turned to the hooded youth and added that Corey had worked hard too. Corey ducked his head and insisted he'd done next to nothing. Jermaine remarked that it was a relief that the casualties were so light, to which Hernando replied without a hint of humor that it was only because the real battle had not even begun yet. The priest's gaze became serious, and he said that something far more terrifying was surely waiting ahead, after which he whispered a short prayer. Hernando nodded towards the fire pit and countered that the journey ahead would not be one of pure horror. When Jermaine asked what he meant, the Duke pointed to the camp itself. Around the fire, a lute played a melody, and exhausted men clapped in time, touching shoulders and raising their goblets. Hernando said that even after a dangerous fight, they can still heal each other's wounds and keep up their fighting spirit. Hernando raised 2 fingers and drew a spark that flew up. With a distinct click, he made it bloom in the night sky. A river of aurora unfolded. Green and blue curtains glided across the stars, washing the tents and faces with soft light. People gasped and laughed. The musician's song grew louder. Hernando watched the enthusiasm grow and remarked that for such people, it was worth simply instilling a little strength in their hearts. Corey sat next to him, his eyes full of a light he never expected to see. After a brief silence, he addressed him as Lord Hernando. The Duke responded with a questioning grunt. Corey continued to squeeze his hands and carefully, but firmly, said that he wanted to learn magic. Hernando studied him carefully and repeated his request for training, and admitted that he had not heard such requests for a very long time. He tilted his head and asked why Corey was suddenly so keen on this. Corey rubbed the cuffs of the other man's gloves and explained that the prince had recommended that he try it, and also admitted that he wants to master magic to make people smile. Hernando, who was sitting next to him, agreed, noticing the hope in his eyes. And Corey said he just wanted to be able to do what Hernando could. The boy then added that a half-orc who used magic for the sake of others would be truly worthy of admiration, and this instantly made the kind little orc smile. Soon morning came. Banners fluttered, saddles creaked. The knights lazily guarded the perimeter, while the third prince of Briol sat on a stone. A horseman came galloping up and called out to him as the men stood up, announcing that imperial knights had arrived to see the prince. The prince raised his head and replied that he would, of course, receive them, and added that since their banner was flying right in front of their ranks, the visitors had clearly arrived intentionally, so they should be let in. The messenger answered in the affirmative and turned his horse. Boots crunched on the grass. The newcomers stopped and bowed, pressing their hands to their chests. Their leader paid his respects to the third prince of Briol and introduced himself as Rufio Artem, an imperial knight and the second son of Count Zini. The prince greeted them and asked if the empire had reached Beshard first. Rufio explained that they were the vanguard. Also, orcs have been spotted near Beshard and are transmitting a warning to nearby units. The prince's gaze moved to the man walking slightly behind him, and he asked about him. He touched his chest and bowed his head, apologizing for the late introduction, and added that at the moment he does not occupy the most honorable position. Recognition resonated inside him like an old trauma. The prince thought they had met again. He remembered that very sword from a life he would rather forget, and mentally named the man Graham Hartnell. The papers might have called him a knight of the Empire, but he himself admitted that he had lost the right to be called a knight, although he still showed respect to the third prince of Briol. Memories rose from the darkness. In his past life, just to keep breathing, the prince clung to his title and pitiful position, begging this man for mercy. Leveling his voice, he greeted Sir Graham warmly. The latter winced and asked not to be called by his title, as he was no longer a knight. The prince asked if he was now serving as a simple soldier, having lost his rank, to which Graham responded in the affirmative, acknowledging how shameful it was. Rufio immediately intervened. He declared that Sir Graham had done nothing wrong, and if anyone was at fault, it lay with the commander under whose command he had been placed. He assured that everyone knew this truth, and added that no knight's name carried such weight as Graham's. The prince thought he had heard about how the Empire had stripped Graham of his knighthood for unclear reasons, completely not expecting to cross paths with him again here, among the allies. He also reflected on the fact that the man who, in another story, had saved his life and held himself more upright and noble than anyone else, now he doubts his own worth and right to bear this title. Graham exhaled and agreed that Rufio was telling the truth. The prince stepped forward and admitted that he had heard a lot about Graham for a long time and considered it an honor to meet him under these banners. Graham looked down and replied that this praise was too generous. The prince smiled softly. Raising his gauntleted hand, he said he called him that precisely because of his modesty. Finally, he bluntly suggested that Graham consider moving to Briol. Graham was taken aback by the proposal and remained silent. Prince Yuri Briol, studying him, reflected that he had always despised the knights of the Empire, but Sir Graham was an exception. A memory flashed through Yuri's mind. Once Sir Graham had spared him and allowed him to escape, although no one else would have done so. Remembering that act of mercy, Yuri realized that the knight must have had to bear the punishment alone. Returning to the present, the prince extended his hand and asked what Sir Graham thought of his proposal. He assured the knight that if he came to Briol, he would be treated with honor and justice. The sincerity in the prince's words warmed Sir Graham's heart. He bowed deeply, showing respect, and apologetically declined the offer. Yuri smiled softly, replying that he respected his decision and did not expect anything else. Moments later, the prince stood alone, looking up. Before him loomed the colossal walls and gates of a vast fortress city. He acknowledged with awe that they had finally arrived. From this height, the city spread out across the plain. It was an allied stronghold, known as the Balchon. Turning excitedly to Hernando, he noticed that the place was much larger than he had imagined. The prince admired the enormous walls and wondered if magic had created them. He added that the Duke of Balchon's family had been producing sorcerers for centuries, and Hernando confirmed this. As they passed through the gate, Hernando warned him to remain alert. The prince frowned, wondering what he meant. Hernando, with a stern, alarmed expression, warned that if the prince let his guard down, he would be devoured. Perhaps not by beasts, but by the mage duke himself. Yuri thought about this, imagining some pompous old man with excessive pride and an excess of magic, and muttered that he had a bad feeling about this. Nevertheless, he spurred his horse forward, figuring that he would soon find out everything himself. Inside the Balchon, in a grand banquet hall, in the center of which a golden statue of a horse shone, aristocrats and soldiers were engaged in polite conversation. The doors swung open, and a woman with flowing red hair entered, introducing herself as Mary Rose Entree, Duchess of Balchon. Prince Yuri, sitting at his desk, he turned to Hernando in surprise and whispered that he wasn't an old man at all. Hernando leaned closer and whispered that there had been a recent change in management. Mary Rose approached the prince, expressing her joy at meeting him and his knights. Sitting down, she asked if he was really the third prince of Briol. He simply nodded, replying with a straight face that he was in command of Briol's forces. Mary smiled playfully, adjusting her hair, and noticed that he was as handsome as she had heard. She asked how old he was, and he answered in an even tone that he was 18. The girl leaned closer with interest, noting that he was only 4 years older than her, so they might have something to talk about. He replied that he wasn't sure. While she tried to charm him with her beauty, the prince silently looked at her, thinking that she skillfully used charm to manipulate people. Gigi recalled bitter memories of such individuals and told himself that, whatever their motives, he could not look upon them favorably. He told her that age meant little and that friendship depended on shared values, not background or gender. Mary feigned surprise. Then she smiled slyly, biting her lip as if she was amused. She asked if he really saw things that way, after which she suddenly stood up, attracting everyone's attention. With a bright smile, she pointed to the prince and his men, announcing that they were the prince and knights from the kingdom of Briol, who will soon fight alongside them against a common enemy. She suggested that everyone take a little time to get to know each other better. Jared whispered to Hernando, wondering why she was putting on such a show. Hernando chuckled softly and looked at the woman more closely, and then he replied that there was probably nothing serious about it. She just liked making acquaintances. Jared, still puzzled, asked about Bruzin, the country she had mentioned. The prince replied that Bruzin was a small country by the ocean, famous for its sailors, stubborn and strong people. While they were talking, a group of people approached the prince. One of them, holding a bottle of wine, addressed him as the Prince of Briol and introduced himself as Jonathan Eagle, commander of Bruzin. Jonathan poured wine into the prince's cup, expressing a desire to treat him to a drink. The prince thanked him with a smile, although he looked at the wine with hidden suspicion. He noticed that this was unexpected, asked if it was really wine, and then added mockingly that such refined alcohol was hardly suitable for a backwater like Bruzin. His remark stunned Bruzin's soldiers. He continued, emphasizing that it was good that they were aware of their status. The tension instantly rose. The enraged soldier rushed at the prince, shouting that he was mocking them and demanding that he be released to teach the arrogant young man a lesson. Another held him back. Jonathan stepped forward, gesturing for calm. Looking at the bottle, he asked whether the prince's words should be regarded as an insult to Bruzin. Yuri, still smiling with a quiet challenge, asked what he would do if this was really the case. His knights, Laurent and Jared, tensed, bracing for trouble. The prince continued, asking if they expected an apology. Jonathan surprised everyone by laughing and saying that there was no need for that. Looking at Mary, who was silently sipping her drink, he added, "There are two possibilities. Either the third prince really is the reckless scoundrel rumored to be, or he was testing them to see if they were fit to be his allies." The enraged soldier shouted again, declaring that he would prove their worth to the prince himself. The prince rose slowly, smiling, and remarked that there was nothing more dangerous than an unreliable ally. Looking Jonathan straight in the eye, he asked if he could prove himself. Jonathan met his gaze and confidently replied that a knight proves his worth with his sword. Mary clapped her hands, drawing all eyes to her. With a beaming smile, she offered to accompany them to the training grounds so they could settle matters properly. Moments later, under the clear sky of Balchan, both sides came together. In the center of the training ground, two knights stood face to face, one from Briol, the other from Bruzin. On the dais above them sat Prince Yuri Briol, Commander Jonathan Eagle, and Lady Mary Rose Entree. Even here, Mary swung her wineglass gracefully. Turning to the prince, she teasingly asked if he'd deliberately started the fight, but admitted it had been quite an entertaining spectacle. Yuri looked away and asked dryly why this innocence, since she'd started the fight herself. Mary only smiled, noticing that he'd rushed to seize the moment anyway. The prince ignored her and focused on the duel below. Proving Bruzin's strength was important, but Yuri wanted to be sure of something else. While studying the Knights of Bruzin, he reflected on the fact that in the coming years, one of them will be recognized as one of the 10 strongest. This was a great honor, intended only for the continent's most powerful warriors, like his father once was. He decided that it would not hurt to get to know such a person in advance. Below, both knights stepped forward to shake hands and introduce themselves. Bruzin's knight introduced himself as Freund, Briol's knight as Laurent. With a mocking grin, Freund stated that his respect ended there, and that they should make this match entertaining. He called Laurent a boy, but Laurent only silently responded with a piercing gaze. Commander Jonathan watched carefully, never losing his concentration. Yuri watched the field with intent curiosity. Someone on the other side remarks that they were looking forward to learning a lot from this fight. Across the continent, countless warriors sought recognition, but only a few were awarded the title of one of the 10 strongest. Those who succeeded in this were respected far beyond the borders of their countries and served as living symbols of deterrence in the face of ongoing wars. Prince Yuri watched the arena, realizing that connections with such promising figures now could turn them into invaluable allies in the future. He reminded himself that friendship between men often begins with a fight. Below, Laurent Flandre stood composed and ready for battle. His opponent, Freund of Bruzin, laughed and said that he had heard of Laurent, the so-called child prodigy, who had won several victories in aristocratic tournaments. He dragged his blade along the ground, closing the distance, and derided these competitions as superficial, showy spectacles for high society. Freund rushed forward, dismissing Laurent's swordsmanship as the fencing of an effeminate nobleman. However, Laurent moved with impeccable control, his eyes capturing every fleeting movement. When Freund's blade struck, it passed through the afterimage. Laurent had already shifted behind him. Freund's confidence wavered for a moment, though he quickly covered it with a grin. He admitted to himself that Laurent's technique was impeccable, but out loud he said that it was too predictable. Gathering all his strength, he shouted that he would take the first victory. But Laurent went forward without hesitation. His counterattack was swift and silent. The sunlight glinted off the steel, and in the blink of an eye, the duel was over. Jonathan rose from his seat in disbelief, and Mary covered her mouth with her hand, muttering something in surprise. Prince Yuri, however, maintained his composure, calmly remarking that the outcome was expected. On the field, Laurent stood completely unperturbed, putting the sword right to Freund's neck. The battered knight, exhausted and covered in bruises, stood in shock, admitting defeat. Yuri rested his chin on his hand, clearly recalling the sequence of movements. Laurent deliberately left a gap near his shoulder to lure Freund into attacking. As soon as Freund took the bait, Laurent turned his wrist, redirected the force of the blow, changed his stance, and delivered a counterpunch in one smooth motion. Yuri mentally noted that Freund had fought well, and an ordinary opponent would have lost, long before he had time to see this attack. Yet Laurent's ability to read an opponent's strength and turn it against them was on a whole other level. Having secured Briol's first victory, Laurent sheathed his sword. Breathing heavily, Freund plunged his own blade into the ground, and with a wry smile he extended his hand, acknowledging defeat and praising Laurent's skill. Laurent reciprocated, noting that it had been a good fight. The knights around applauded, recognizing the worthy outcome despite the loss. Commander Jonathan proudly noted that Laurent's skill was impressive and that it was to be expected from the land of knights. Yuri responded by asking them not to flatter them, as Bruzin's fighter was also a good one. However, with a weak smile, he noted that the score was now 1-0 and asked if Jonathan intended to retreat. Jonathan chuckled and declared that was out of the question. Without hesitation, he called another of his men. The massive knight stepped forward, his two-handed sword resting loosely on one shoulder. Jonathan announced him as Jose Eritre, the strongest knight in Bruzin, and a man striving to become one of the top 10. Yuri narrowed his eyes in intrigue and muttered Jose's name with a smile. Mary, with a playful glint in her eye, commented on his impressive physique. He entered the arena and confirmed Jonathan's order with a firm declaration of his readiness to obey. Jonathan proudly proclaimed that Jose was the greatest warrior in their ranks. Yuri turned to his soldiers and called Jared. Jared froze in complete shock, and he pointed uncertainly at himself, clarifying whether the prince really meant him. The prince's face darkened, and he shouted at him to hurry. Reluctantly, Jared rose, pulling on his helmet to the approving shouts of his comrades. When the knights met in the center, the difference in size was striking. Jose introduced himself with a smile and expressed anticipation of the fight, while Jared, already embarrassed, stumbled over his own name. He clearly saw the thirst for victory in Jose's eyes and mentally noted that this man lived for battle. Jose noticed his hesitation and laughed, noting that Jared looked like the kind of guy who could make an opponent focus. Without further warning, Jose raised his two-handed sword, declaring that he would strike first. Before Jared could react, the huge knight, a blur of silhouette, closed the distance, and the power of his swing made the earth shake. Jared's instincts screamed at him to dodge, and he barely managed to avoid the blow. He instantly realized that trying to block such power would simply blow him to pieces. Jose's attacks came one after another. Swift, heavy, merciless. The horizontal swing narrowly missed Jared's chest, cutting off a strand of his hair. Noticing Jared's fearful look, Jose mockingly remarked that he must be incredibly relaxed to worry about his hair in the middle of a fight. The taunt brought Jared back to his full concentration. Steel met steel in a swift exchange of blows. Sparks flew in all directions as the knights came close together. Jared struggled to keep up, his hands shaking from the effort. From above, Prince Yuri watched what was happening, fascinated. He thought that Jose Eritre's power was wild, yet honed by graceful technique. And then he smiled, realizing that in front of him was truly a man who could one day take a place among the 10 strongest. Jose suddenly grabbed Jared and effortlessly threw him over his shoulder, and then with a crushing force he threw it to the ground, and dust rose into the air. Jared gasped in pain, but still tried to rise, his body shaking, until a commanding voice ordered them to stop. The fight was declared over. Jose immediately stepped forward, extending his hand to Jared and praising him for holding out so long. Exhausted but smiling faintly, Jared shook his hand and replied that he had learned a lot from him. Prince Yuri, who was watching from above, rose from his seat, and with a satisfied smile, he announced that the score in the duel was now 1-1, and both knights had fought superbly. The audience burst into applause, welcoming the valiant spectacle. Mary set down her glass with a clink and turned to the prince, asking with feigned tenderness if this meant they were finally finished getting to know each other. Yuri, already aware of her intention to tease him, casually replied that building trust between allies was indeed important. But Mary didn't stop there. She approached him, noticing that she was disappointed with his answer. Yuri met her gaze warily. Then, in one smooth movement, she wrapped her arms around his shoulders and gently pushed me back into my seat, her smile both playful and challenging. She gently reminded him that he himself had called getting to know each other an important matter. With a coquettish laugh, she turned his face towards her, insisting that, contrary to his words, he seemed to be planning to postpone their personal acquaintance. Her cheeks flushed as she leaned closer, pressing herself against him and accentuating her figure while her tone dripped with feigned innocence. However, none of her tricks worked on the prince. He merely sighed, his face impassive, completely unfazed. Before Mary could continue, Jonathan came up from behind and reminded her that she had promised to show everyone her office. She turned around, still holding her hand on the prince's shoulder, and tapped her forehead, remembering her words. Yuri let out a quiet breath, realizing it was all just an act. Jonathan smoothed over the awkward moment with a laugh and asked if she could take them there right now. Although she was irritated by this interference, Mary hid her feelings behind a polite smile and agreed. Turning to Yuri, she invited him to join her. The prince politely declined, citing the need to deal with his knights. Before she could insist, he stood up, gave a quick smile, and strode away across the training grounds, throwing over his shoulder that he had to go. Mary was speechless and flushed with annoyance. Jonathan, standing next to her, burst out laughing at the sight. Unable to contain herself, Mary clenched her fists and screamed in rage that Prince Yuri was completely unbearable. Soon after, the allied forces began to converge on Balchan. The flags of all the kingdoms fluttered in the wind, and the arrival of the supreme commander of the empire, clad in shining armor, caused a wave of excitement throughout the entire camp. Each faction began to evaluate the others, measuring their strength and potential. Only Briol's knights remained absolutely calm. Prince Yuri stood in the open field, silently looking down at his sword. Hernando approached cautiously and asked if it was wise for them to focus solely on training. While the others were discussing strategies and alliances, Yuri confirmed this without hesitation, explaining that these so-called alliances would inevitably prove superficial. Hernando blinked in surprise. The prince explained that each state had sent its strongest warriors, but they were all too proud to truly cooperate. Every commander considered himself superior to the others, so words alone would accomplish nothing. Hernando nodded slowly, beginning to understand. The glint of his blade was reflected in Yuri's eyes, as he thought that in the end, the only true language between warriors was strength. Turning to one of his knights, he smiled and asked if they should have a duel. Laurent stepped forward confidently, sword in hand, saying that it would be an honor for him. Yuri pointed his sword at him, warning him not to hold back. Laurent smiled, looking down as mana began to rage around him, and added that he didn't even think about holding back. The air crackled with energy as both men took up fighting stances. Yuri felt the pressure of Laurent's pure, concentrated mana and thought that this was exactly what he expected from him. He repeated the stance and thought that Laurent really was the perfect training partner. The next moment, Laurent rushed forward with incredible speed, his sword cutting through the air with precision. The impact rumbled like thunder as Yuri blocked the lunge. Sparks flew, scattering in bright arcs across the ground. Laurent pushed him forward, stomping heavily to gain momentum, and his sword now glowed with mana. He swung again, faster and harder, but Yuri dodged. His movements were clean and calculated. Laurent didn't retreat. His sword became a blur, stabbing and slashing in a relentless flurry. Yuri dodged at the very last moment. One of the thrusts passed so close that it cut off a strand of his hair. Laurent's precise attacks left no room for error. He remained the same, clean, disciplined, deadly. Yuri remembered how Laurent had killed him in his past life. Even then, his blade remained pure, and his blows were driven not by anger, but by a clear purpose. Yuri smiled faintly. Even if he ever entrusted his life to Laurent's sword, now his duty was to stand proudly before him as an equal. With renewed determination, Yuri met Laurent's next blow head-on, parrying, deflecting, and counterattacking in perfect rhythm. Their blades clashed again and again, each blow sounding like a symphony of steel. Laurent was thrown back by the force of the collision, his boots skidding across the ground before he regained his balance. The moment he stopped, he rushed forward again. Their swords met again in the rays of the sun, and each blow became sharper, faster, and heavier than the last. The fight grew increasingly fierce, both warriors pushing their limits as the thrill of battle lit up their faces. Briol's soldiers burst into cheers, encouraging both their prince and his rival. Watching from afar, Jared muttered in irritation that the two were acting too fiercely for a simple sparring match. Behind him, a deep voice agreed, noting that Prince Briol had remarkable skill. Jared turned and froze, disbelief contorting his face, when he saw a huge knight towering over him, smiling down at him. It was Jose of Bruzine. Then Jose shouted across the field, saying that he had a request for the prince. The fighting stopped immediately, and both Laurent and Yuri turned as Jose stepped forward, declaring that he wished to fight. Yuri's grin widened. He placed his sword on his shoulder. He said that if Jose wanted to fight, he wouldn't refuse. In a teasing tone, he added that he would lend him Jared instead. Jared's eyes widened and he cried out in surprise, but before he could resist, Jose easily slung Jared over his shoulder and strode away. While Jared struggled helplessly, reaching out to the prince, Yuri merely waved and told him to have fun. When the laughter died down, Laurent walked over and bowed, thanking Yuri for the opportunity to learn. The prince told him that he had done well and added that he was looking forward to their next duel. With a nod, Laurent left, leaving Yuri standing in quiet thought. A few minutes later, Yuri headed towards a large tree at the edge of the field. Its broad branches provided cool shade, and he sank beneath them, leaning against the trunk. As fatigue began to set in, he quietly asked if there were any results. A figure stepped out from the shadows beneath the tree. It was Asuna. Yuri greeted her and noted that her stealth skills had improved. She replied that perhaps that was the case, although she was still better suited to the open plains. He nodded and asked what she had learned about the stranger. She reported that she had discovered traces of the man's movements. Yuri's gaze sharpened as the image of a foreigner appeared in his mind, one of the 10 strongest on the continent, a warrior from the eastern lands. He remembered that in his past life, this same man had stood up to Orqua alone. No one ever found out the reason, but Yuri knew one thing. His enemy's enemy could become an ally. He praised Asuna for her work and said they needed to find this man before the upcoming battle with Orqua. She immediately accepted the order. Yuri was lost in thought. They couldn't afford any delays. A memory surfaced. A bloodied stranger pierced by a monster. His face darkened with the realization that in the next great war, this warrior would fall among the 10 strongest. Then his thoughts turned to another figure, Rogna Gustav Granzian, the emperor's half-brother and supreme commander of the allied forces. Stories from his past life surfaced, his face, and then a dimly lit room, the smell of candle smoke, and he himself in his youth, whispering reassurance to his bride, the princess of the empire, Irina. She asked excitedly what they would do if they were discovered. He smiled and told her not to worry, promising to take full responsibility. As their lips came closer, a rough voice interrupted them, telling them to find a more suitable place for their antics. They froze and turned to see Irina's uncle, Rogna Gustav, lounging lazily on the couch. Irina, her face flushed, stuttered as she mentioned his title. Rogna rose slowly, scratching his head and muttering that their noise was bothering him. He beckoned Yuri with a wave of his hand and half-seriously asked if he really liked Irina. Noticing that he seemed too unflappable for a man in love, Irina became embarrassed, while Yuri stutteredly confirmed that this was true. Rogna sighed, calling the matter pointless, and turned to the door. Adding that Yuri could handle it himself, he waved his hand dismissively and left them standing there in complete silence. Even then, Yuri sensed that Rogna Gustav Granzian was no ordinary man. Now, in the present, those memories have faded. The Balshad Castle War Council Hall appeared before my eyes. At a huge table, the commanders of the allied kingdoms quietly awaited the supreme commander, and they called him Prince Lionheart, the emperor's half-brother. Many enthusiastically discussed establishing connections with such a figure. Yuri silently noted that even on the brink of war, people find time for politics and flattery. Suddenly, a calm voice from behind remarked that they seemed to be having a good time. Gigi froze with a chill down his spine. Rona walked past him with a slight smile as he returned to his seat. Yuri watched him go, shocked that he hadn't sensed the stranger's approach. Rogna clasped his hands, resting his elbows on the table, and looked around the room. He said that if the situation became even more relaxed, it would cause trouble. As he spoke, he tapped the armrest once. Then again. At the second tap, the air filled with crushing pressure. The commanders froze, their breath caught under an invisible weight. Even Yuri felt sweat break out on his forehead. In that moment, he understood why he was called the Lionheart Prince of the Empire. Ragnar Gustav Granzian didn't just wield power, he personified it. He declared that he despised cowards. Any fugitive would be struck down by his hand. Those who stood firm would be honored as true knights and rewarded for their bravery. When he finally asked if anyone had any questions, the tension snapped like a bowstring being released. No one spoke until Yuri raised his hand. Rogna nodded, allowing him to speak. Meeting the commander-in-chief's piercing gaze, Yuri asked what the Empire's current assessment of the Orc forces was. For a moment, Ragna merely studied him, and then a faint smirk appeared on his lips. He asked who this impudent young man was. Yuri introduced himself. Ragna chuckled, saying he had heard about it from George, and added that this was indeed a pressing issue. He stood up and crossed the room, and he placed a heavy hand on Yuri's shoulder, explaining, "The Empire has confirmed the appearance of the Orc Orqua, who has united 3 great tribes under his rule." Ragna added that Orqua's power threatened the continent. He then pointed to a large map on the table, marking several locations near Baoshan. The Orcish vanguard, he said, had already set up camp dangerously close. In 2 days, their armies would face each other in the first major battle, and he announced that Briol's troops would lead this attack. Fixing a piercing gaze on Yuri, he asked if he would accept command of the vanguard. Yuri hesitated briefly, then exhaled, and with firm determination, he replied that he would take command and lead the troops from the front. That night, under a star-studded sky, Yuri sat alone by the fire. The flames were reflected in his eyes as he stared at it, lost in thought. The quiet crackling of the firewood was interrupted by a teasing voice. Mary Rosenther, the Mage Duchess, she approached with a confident smile and sat down next to him. The girl noticed that, although he had received a place in the vanguard, he did not seem happy about it. Yuri asked what brought her to the camp. She replied that curiosity had brought her there, and that she wanted to understand the man everyone was now talking about. He replied that she seemed unusually interested in him, and she countered that he gave her too little opportunity to learn anything about him. Her tone softened as she said that the lives of the people of Baoshan were in his hands, and she needed to know that he was someone to trust. She sincerely asked him to give her an honest answer instead of that blank, worried look he had. She added with a slight smile that if he did this, she would help him in the coming battle. Yuri asked how exactly she intended to do this. In response, she raised her hand over the fire, and the flames came to life at her fingertips. She reminded him that she was a Mage Duchess and assured him that she would be much more useful on the plains than his knight Hernando. Yuri watched the dance of flames in silence for a long moment, before quietly saying that many of their men would die in the coming battle. She blinked in surprise as he continued, explaining that the vanguard always suffered the heaviest losses. "The men laughing around the fires today," he said. "Tomorrow, they will become corpses on the battlefield." He accepted this responsibility and had no intention of turning away from it. His words made her fall silent, and Yuri simply gazed into the distance. Then, with a sudden burst of emotion, he clenched his fist and declared that, as much as he didn't want to seem sentimental, but he simply wanted to properly shoulder this heavy burden given to him by fate. The girl's eyes immediately lit up at the protagonist's words, and she said his determination was admirable. So strong, she admitted. What upsets her even more is that he thinks about his soldiers before her. Smiling despite herself, she extended her hand and swore that she, Mary Rosenthor, the Duchess Mage of Baoshan, would fight by his side. Yuri accepted her oath with gratitude, replying that he was looking forward to her help. 2 days later, the first great battle began. In the dark forests around Baoshan, lines of armored orcs advanced in battle formation, their guttural battle cries shaking the trees. Some rode monstrous beasts. Opposite, behind the wood and earth fortifications, the allied armies gathered. Supreme Commander Rogna Gustav Granzian and the Mage Duchess watched the battlefield from a high tower. Riel's banner unfurled in the wind, its colors catching the morning light. Below them, Prince Yuri Briol stood at the head of his troops, his knights lined up behind him, and his voice was loud and confident as he ordered his men to prepare their weapons and get ready for battle. Rogna looked down at Mary from above and noted that it was time for the vanguard to move out. He asked why she stayed with him instead of going to a safe place. She calmly replied that she had been told to stay where she was and do something. He frowned, repeating her words in disbelief, but she only nodded. Soon the watch horn sounded. The orc army had been spotted. Yuri leaped onto his horse and rode forward, gripping his spear tightly as his command echoed across the line. He called out to all the allied troops, demanding to know if they were ready, and loud shouts of approval answered him. With a sharp tug of the reins, he spurred his horse forward. The ground shook under the onslaught of his vanguard as the orcs poured forth to meet them. Watching from above, Ragna muttered that the prince's recklessness bordered on madness, and that such bravado would surely lead to his death. Before he could say anything else, Mary began to chant the spell. The fire concentrated around her staff, swirling into a massive sphere, which grew brighter with each passing moment. She asked Ragna for permission to act, her eyes blazing with determination. He cried out in alarm as the flaming sphere grew to enormous proportions, the air warping with heat. She calmly replied that this was the task Prince Yuri had entrusted to her, and with a wave of her staff, she directed the raging flames towards the ranks of the orcs. The orcs roared in panic, trying to scatter as the fire rushed down. However, Yuri and his soldiers continued forward without hesitation. Rogna's face darkened as he realized the spell's trajectory. He warned that the explosion would engulf their own people as well. Mary only smiled weakly and replied that this was also part of Yuri's plan. On the battlefield, Yuri rushed through the chaos. His spear sparkled like his smile when he cut the orc in front of him with a precise blow. The ground shook as his horse charged forward. Then a fireball crashed to the ground. A powerful explosion ripped through the forest, engulfing everything in a sea of flame. Before the flames could reach his troops, Yuri raised his sword high. Mana gushed from the blade, and a stream of water materialized out of thin air, forming a protective barrier that instantly surrounded the entire vanguard. Ragna watched this in shock, realizing the protagonist's plan. In the glare of this hell, Yuri stood unwaveringly at the very forefront. As his horse raced across the blazing battlefield, jets of water swirled around him, shielding the soldiers from the fire. His command came through clearly over the roar of the fire. He ordered them to attack again. The vanguard moved forward, cutting down the scattered and blinded orcs before them. When the next wave of enemies appeared, Yuri jumped off his horse, thrust his spear into the ground, and rushed forward. In one smooth motion, he grabbed the weapon again and threw it with deadly accuracy. The spear shot up into the air and pierced the orc's skull, and his body fell into the mud with a heavy thud. The reptilian creature he rode on rushed forward in a frenzy, but Prince Yuri remained collected. Before the creature could strike, one of his knights rushed past and then slashed the creature's head clean off. Without slowing down, Yuri continued his advance. Across the battlefield, Jose of Bruzen remarked to his men with a broad grin that the Knights of Briol were indeed living up to their reputation. Then, with a laugh, he soared high into the air, his great sword spinning, cutting down a group of orcs in one sweeping motion. Elsewhere, the Holy Kingdom's princess ordered Briel's vanguard to be defended. Her soldiers immediately rushed forward to reinforce the front line. Hours passed in a storm of steel and blood, until one soldier shouted that the enemy line had been breached. Another called for no quarter, and the battlefield erupted with renewed vigor. From his position, Rogna watched the battle with satisfaction, thoughtfully rubbing his chin. He muttered that the Allied army's performance had exceeded all expectations. The troops' morale, he noted, had skyrocketed as Prince Yuri Briol personally led the charge from the front, crushing the orc ranks with sheer force of will. He added that the combination of the Duchess's fire mage and Yuri's water magic ensured victory, although he called such tactics dangerously reckless. Turning to Mary, who was standing next to him, he asked if she had consciously gone along with this plan. Mary responded with a slight, unapologetically innocent smile. She admitted that she had initially tried to dissuade the prince, but was now glad he hadn't listened to her. Adjusting a strand of her hair, she added that he had fought with superb style. Her gaze softened, lingering on Yuri fighting below. She quietly murmured that he possessed a rare, intriguing spark that set him apart from the rest. Rogna sighed and thought that for the first clash of Allied forces, this was a truly impressive start. By dusk, the battle was over. Corpses lay piled everywhere, and Briel's flag fluttered proudly atop a mound of fallen soldiers. That night, Balshad Castle glowed with the warm light of lanterns. In her chambers, Mary sat at her desk, her quill scratching across the parchment as she wrote down the events of the day. She wrote until the silence was broken by a slight rustling sound. Her hand froze mid-sentence, and her eyes narrowed. She noticed that the prince was lucky to win, and then she sharply asked who dared to enter her chambers without permission. The air shook, and Hernando appeared, breaking his spell of stealth with a quiet chuckle. He asked her not to speak so harshly, reminding him that he had once been her teacher and reproaching her for at least asking how he was doing. Her face turned cold, and she replied that a true teacher would never abandon a student. Hernando sat down casually, brushing off her accusations. He said he'd only come to see how far his former student had come. Mary crossed her arms over her chest and accused him of lying, saying that he was really interested in her research into the formula of transcendental interpretation. She explained dryly that there was progress. The spell, aimed at linking languages through shared meaning, had recently begun to weakly resonate with ancient magic. Hernando's stern expression softened, and he asked her to keep him informed if her work progressed further. She smirked, asking why on earth she would do that. His tone became significant when he replied that the reason was that this matter concerned Prince Yuri. Her eyes narrowed. Regaining her composure, Mary asked if Yuri's fate really mattered that much to him. Before he could answer, she reminded him of the great laws that forbade mages of his rank from directly interfering in human history. Hernando nodded, admitting that he knew about it, but added that many were already embroiled in the prince's fate, including even the supreme commander of the empire itself. At dawn, the allied camp stirred under the first pale rays of light. In the supreme commander's tent, Yuri stood in front of Rogna, who was sitting at his desk studying a map. Rogna informed him that he would be leading a reconnaissance mission. Yuri frowned slightly, doubting whether he was suited to such a task. Rogna smiled, assuring him that it fit perfectly. Later that evening, the camp fell silent, but Rogna's tent remained lit. Yuri returned, wanting confirmation of his orders. The commander-in-chief leaned over the same map, running his finger along the eastern plains. He explained that the army would advance into Orc territory the next day, and that ambushes should be expected. Yuri asked if he intended to form a separate detachment to guard the army's flank. Rogna smiled faintly and replied that Yuri had guessed correctly. After a pause, Yuri respectfully replied that, although he appreciated the commander-in-chief's trust, Briel's forces bore the brunt of the previous battle. He says that for the sake of justice, another state should now lead the offensive. Rogna chuckled, noting that there was no place for justice among vain commanders. He declared that he only trusted what he had personally witnessed, and of all the armies, he trusts Briel's strength the most. As he began to formulate the order, Yuri interrupted him with a calm smile. He said he had another suggestion worth trying. Late in the night, messengers delivered Rogna Granzian's orders. The Holy Kingdom was informed that the main army would march under the cover of reconnaissance groups from each nation. Commander Jonathan read out the order at Bruson's camp. The Supreme Commander intends to select reconnaissance detachments through direct competition between armies. That night, Jose laughed quietly, noticing that the commander-in-chief clearly wanted to stir up some excitement in the ranks of the troops. As Jonathan rolled up the parchment, he smiled and said that Rogna had been right to demand only the strongest, and that he hadn't felt that way in a long time. In Briel's camp, Hernando grimly read the same order about tracking down orcs and collecting their right ears. The squad with the largest haul would receive priority in the next command. Then he turned to Yuri and asked if this strange competition had been his idea. Yuri confirmed that it was. He calmly noted that the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief puts everyone on an equal footing, and this is an ideal chance to measure the true strength of each state. Jared frowned, expressing concern that reconnaissance missions required different training, and the Knights of Briel weren't accustomed to this kind of work. But Yuri dismissed his concerns with quiet confidence, answering simply that he had his own method. He said that he would move forward with the Allied forces, and morning came. Rogna stood before the lined-up armies. The task was simple: hunt down the orcs, eliminate them, and collect their right ears as trophies. The state that returns with the largest number will receive priority command in future operations. His words caused a sudden silence among the troops. Among those listening attentively were the second princess of the Holy Kingdom, Commander Jonathan of Bruson, and Prince Yuri Briel himself. Rogna then held up the hourglass, declaring that once the sand began to flow, the test would begin. He turned them over, and when the golden grains of sand began to fall, He declared the competition open. The commanders immediately mounted their horses and led their forces in 3 different directions under the blazing morning sun. Watching them leave, Rogna's expression noticeably softened. A knight standing nearby remarked that he seemed to have a special faith in Prince Briol. Rogna admitted that this was indeed the case. The boy was young, he said, but smart, and if he showed himself again, Rogna might take a liking to him. Far ahead, Yuri led his forces across the plains, their banners fluttering in the wind. Jared rode closer to him, asking if there really was a plan. Yuri replied that their first step was simply to find the orcs. Jared muttered that finding them and surviving an encounter with them were 2 different things. But Yuri's calm confidence didn't waver at all. He repeated that he had a plan. A moment later, a lookout shouted from ahead, pointing northeast. Yuri followed his gaze and noticed a large detachment. These were orc cavalry, rushing across the open steppe. He said it would be perfect, and pulled out a small necklace with a glowing crimson stone, and whispered that the time had come to lure them. The stone pulsed with a rhythmic red glow that shimmered across the plains. In the distance, the orcs' eyes began to glow crimson, one after another. Falling under the influence of the stone, they turned as one and roared, galloping at full speed straight towards Yuri's position. His knights cried out in unison, their weapons glinting in the sun. Jared exhaled heavily, but nevertheless drew his blade. Raising his sword high, Yuri reminded his soldiers of their task. Their trophies should be the right ears of the orcs. But he smiled and ordered them not to overdo it, and then gave the command to attack. The earth shook as the 2 forces collided. Laurent jumped off his horse at full gallop, leaping high and aiming at the orc in the front ranks, and then cleanly severing the monster's neck before landing lightly on the corpse. Blood spurted as he pulled his sword free, immediately rushing back into the fray. Briol's troops fought with merciless precision, their formation disciplined and efficient. The orcs were quickly killed. Then a massive orc chieftain appeared, riding a massive lizard-like creature, roaring and swinging a colossal axe. Yuri immediately noticed him and spurred his horse forward. The chieftain's blow came down, but before it reached its target, Yuri's blade flashed once and the monster's eyes no longer glowed red, for with a clean and effortless movement, he cut his throat. He galloped past without even looking back, surveying the battlefield. Yuri remained absolutely calm and mentally assessed the 2 instruments he had prepared. A necklace with a crimson crystal from the bandit camp rested dimly on his chest. The second item, in his opinion, possessed far more destructive power. Before he could do anything, a knight rolled up with a bloody sack and proudly reported the collection of 10 right ears, declaring a huge lead over the rest. Yuri glanced at the bag, then at the carnage around him, and smiled weakly, replying that it was not enough. The knight hesitated, not understanding what he meant. Without further ado, Yuri pulled out a small knife and plunged it into the ground. The moment it touched the surface, the ground split with a blinding flash. A column of light shot into the sky, shaking the plains. The knight recoiled as a blinding energy gushed from the ground, while Yuri remained sitting motionless on his horse, surrounded by a light ripple of light. A confident smile lit up his face as he announced that they would hunt down every last orc left in the area before returning. The soul-splitting technique was a rare and dangerous mana art that was said to manifest differently depending on the user's will. Yuri studied the dagger embedded in the ground, explaining that it resonated with the planet's pulse through a sword technique based on seismic vibration. By combining this frequency with soul-splitting, he was able to expand his perception throughout the entire area, sensing every living being that touched it. As he concentrated, his vision became hazy. He sensed the movements of every orc on the plains, his own troops, and the trembling of beasts in the distance. But the result left him unsatisfied. Muttering that it was still not enough, he turned to his men and declared that they would not rest until the plains were cleared of orcs. Raising his sword, he flared with aura again. As dusk approached, in the Allied command tent, Supreme Commander Ragna stood by the hourglass, waiting for the last grains of sand to fall. He announced that the time allotted for the intelligence competition had expired. One by one, the nations presented their results. The first group stepped forward, but when Ragna turned out their pouch, not a single orc ear fell out of it. His face hardened as he reminded them that their mission was reconnaissance and not a leisurely stroll. With disgust, he threw away the empty bag and called out to the next ones. But every nation came out with the same result, empty-handed and heads down. When the last soldier approached, Ragna's patience snapped. He slapped his forehead. After all, how could so many armies not kill a single orc? The silence was cut by the sharp voice of Commander Jonathan of Bruisen, stepped forward with gleaming eyes. When Ragna opened his pouch, several orc ears spilled out onto the table. Ragna approvingly praised Bruisen for her 6 trophies, calling it her best result. Jonathan bowed modestly and replied that they were simply lucky to have encountered the orcs. Ragna chuckled and replied that luck was also a kind of power, and many warriors died precisely because of its lack. He then reached for another pouch, stating that the Empire's troops were also involved in the test, and dumped a total of 12 orc ears onto the table. The room was plunged into a mixture of whispers and surprise. Ragna grinned. Jonathan's face fell. He knew the Empire's might, but the fact that they'd collected twice as much loot by leaving an hour late stung him deeply. Across the room, the Holy Kingdom's second princess bit her lips, silently cursing how easily the Empire had overshadowed them. Ragna sensed the tension, but calmly urged the leaders not to lose heart. He emphasized that the only thing that mattered now was what they could achieve next. He turned to his assistant, asking if there were any more reports, and the soldier pointed uncertainly to the large sack from Briol's squad, which was thrown onto the table with a heavy thud. The commanders turned around in shock, and Ragna half-jokingly raised an eyebrow. When the bag was opened, dozens of orc ears spilled out. Standing before them, covered in blood but completely unperturbed, Yuri explained that there was no secret to their success. They just worked harder than anyone else. That night, Briol's camp was buzzing with energy. Sir Jared supervised the unloading of supplies, reminding the soldiers to handle the crates with care. As he passed between the rows of tents, a knight from another nation deliberately bumped him with his shoulder, turning around bitterly and muttering something before leaving, which caused Jared to frown, confused by such hostility. Later, he found Yuri by the fire, sharing a modest meal with another knight, and reported that people from other camps had started to fight. Yuri immediately stood up, asking if it was true. As they walked, Jared told them about the unflattering rumors. Yuri only smiled, noting that after their victory, they were the center of attention, and others' envy was the natural price of success. He told Jared to take it as a compliment, because others' envy was the best proof of their achievements. Then his gaze moved to a nearby cage with tied and silent orcs. He asked about the sorcerer among them, and Corey, their translator, stepped forward nervously. Corey explained hesitantly that one of the orcs had spoken. Intrigued, Yuri ordered him to translate, and Corey reported that the orc had spoken words about a black dog. He added with concern that the orcs were spreading stories of a knight who could sniff them out like a hunting dog. Jared snorted, trying to hold back his laughter, and Yuri frowned, asking if the orcs really meant him. Corey confirmed this, adding that the name was pronounced with both fear and respect. Yuri sighed, muttering that he would prefer to be called Wolf. Jared burst out laughing, earning a sharp glare, before quickly declaring that he wasn't laughing at all. Yuri turned to the prisoners with a slight smile, saying that at least his reputation had begun to spread among the enemy. Corey then explained that the orcs had nicknamed him the Emperor's Black Dog for his service to the Empire and his hunting of Orqua on its behalf. Yuri's face darkened, and his aura flared with rage. He repeated the name under his breath with disbelief. And then he growled, so loud that the orcs dared to call him an imperial hound. Mana bubbled around him, and his hand reached for his sword, but Jared shouted at him to stop, urging him not to kill the prisoners. After a long, tense pause, Yuri slowly exhaled and put the weapon back into its sheath. A shocked Corey added that Chief Karui was gathering warriors in Garama to intercept his allies. This brutal warlord had united the tribe solely through fear. Yuri's anger gave way to cold determination. He stroked Corey's head approvingly, saying he had done a good job, and instructed Jared to finish the interrogation. He then added that he would personally deliver this intelligence to the Supreme Commander. Later that evening, in Ragna's tent, Yuri stood at attention while the Commander-in-Chief studied the report, when suddenly, without warning, Ragna asked if he had a girlfriend. A shocked Yuri replied that he did not. Ragna nodded thoughtfully and asked his age, and hearing that he was 18, he cheerfully remarked that perhaps it was still a bit early, but he just happens to have a beautiful niece growing up. Yuri froze, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Ragna laughed, saying they could discuss it another time, and dismissed him with a wave of his hand. Once outside, Yuri wandered aimlessly in the cool night air, muttering something about Ragna's niece. Then a memory struck him like lightning. The imperial princess he had been betrothed to in his past life. His face instantly turned pale. He clutched his hair in horror and screamed that he had to stay as far away from her as possible. frightening the soldier standing nearby. But before he had time to come to his senses, a familiar voice called his name. He turned around and froze. At that moment, Yuri realized, and his panic was replaced by relief, and a smile slowly spread across his face. He thought to himself that fate had been kind to him, and his unexpected savior had appeared herself. The second princess, commander of the Holy Kingdom's army, stood before him, looking extremely puzzled by his reaction. She asked why he was looking at her like that. At that moment, the princess seemed radiant, almost divine. The scene changed. Under a torchlit sky, Yuri pondered his predicament. He decided that in order to avoid Ragnar's persistent matchmaking, he needed to fake a relationship. But not with just anyone. It had to be someone who was indebted to him, someone without romantic attachments, so as not to complicate the situation, and who could never refuse his request. His eyes narrowed as the answer came. It had to be her. She looked scared when he approached, and when she asked what had happened, he called her by name, Sybil, and reminded her that he had once saved her life. Sybil confirmed that she remembered, although she seemed wary, and the main character said that he needed her help, insisting that only she was capable of doing this. To her question, he simply replied that he would rely on her and ran away. The confused girl became very indignant and demanded an explanation. As she tried to comprehend his words, a smiling knight approached them, respectfully addressing her as Your Highness. She recognized him, Sir Finnick, and asked why he was smiling like that. He responded warmly that he sincerely supported both of them, and they look good as a couple. In general, he's very happy that they got together. Sybil fell silent, wishing he would disappear along with everyone else. And above them, the silent and merciless night sky stretched endlessly. The next day, sunlight flooded the green hills as the allied columns moved forward. One knight rode up to Yuri, saying that he had heard the latest rumor. When Yuri asked which one, the man replied that this was precisely why His Majesty constantly summoned him. He supposedly planned to get married. Yuri immediately dismissed him, telling them not to talk nonsense. He remarked that they must be terribly bored to believe such nonsense, and looking up, he frowned, noticing a flock of crows circling in the distance. A few moments later, the sky above them was completely filled with crows, and the sound of hooves echoed across the pass, until one of the riders suddenly cried out in alarm. Another knight volunteered to check out what was ahead, and Yuri said he would go with him. After a brief confirmation, the two galloped into the gorge. In the shadowy ravine, Jared gasped. The words caught in his throat when he realized the whole horrific picture. Corpses were hanging on spears driven into the wet stone, and below them, dark pools of their blood. He looked up and muttered in disbelief, wondering if they were all human. Ragnar gave a short, humorless laugh and commented that the orcs had a rather creative sense of hospitality. Having studied the location of the bodies, the main character came to the conclusion that the orcs did not eat their victims, and instead displayed them as mocking trophies of their victory, which he took to mean that the orcs were saying, "This is all you're worth to us." Yuri turned to Ragnar, saying that morale would fall if people saw this, and asked permission to clean up this mess. Ragnar nodded briefly, and his commanding voice ordered the people of Briol to prepare torches. Soon the flames rose, burning the macabre exhibition to ashes, and a shocked Jared asked how anyone could commit such cruelty. Yuri told him not to dwell on it, and then turned around and shouted orders, urging Guinness and Dyke not to go too deep and to report back. Their weak reply came through the echoes, confirming that they would return. A few moments later, one of the partners noticed with alarm that something was wrong with the scene, and when the other asked what he meant, the first one pointed to the weapon stuck in the ground, explaining that the arrowheads and spears were facing downwards, in the opposite direction from the impaled corpses. He said it looked as if the victims had been struck from above, but before these words had time to escape from the lips, as the arrow pierced Guinness's back, and a sudden cry rent the air. Dyke shouted his comrade's name, then again, louder, giving in to growing panic, and drawing his sword, he roared that they were under attack. High above, hidden orc archers fired a volley. One of the soldiers, noticing the rain of arrows falling, he froze in horror, thinking only about how to escape. But he stopped, remembering Guinness, not daring to abandon him, while Yuri rushed forward, running through the slippery mud of the gorge. Noticing Dyke, he shouted a warning, grabbed his shoulder, and jumped, twisting in the air. Blue energy swirled around him as he waved his hand, creating a barrier that deflected the flying arrows with a blinding arc, landing among broken shafts on the blood-soaked ground. Yuri glanced around the scene and muttered that Guinness was still alive. He ordered Dyke and Simon to immediately request help from the Holy Kingdom, ordering that his name be mentioned so that they could be helped without asking any questions. Squinting towards the edge of the canyon, he grimly admitted that they had been completely deceived. An orc archer grinned above, and, watching the arrogant orcs retreat, Yuri guessed their plan. They'd only come to deliver a warning, and had no reason to stay any longer, which made his jaw clench. If the orcs believed that they could kill them at any moment, they were deeply mistaken. Putting his hand on his sword, Yuri swore that next time he would repay them in kind. Later at the command post, with the sky bathed in golden light, Regressed summed up gloomily that a squad of orcs had positioned themselves at the top of the canyon for an ambush, adding that retreat was no longer possible and they would have to eliminate the threats. He turned to Yuri, asking what he planned to do, and a faint smile appeared on Yuri's lips. He replied that there was only one logical choice, advising the commander to order the archers to maintain constant pressure, preventing the orcs from appearing above. Then, clasping his hands together as a blue aura flared around him, he told them with quiet confidence to leave an ambush party in the canyon for him. In the valley, the orcs were already waiting along the cliffs, lurking in silent ambush. One of them tensed, sensing a strange presence below. Burning with curiosity, he stood up with a bow in his hands and tried to look down. But before he could see anything, arrows cut through the air, forcing him to duck. The shafts struck the stones, sparking and shattering on impact, and the orc growled. Below, at the entrance to the valley, stood Regressed, accompanied by 3 night archers. Regressd's voice cut through the tension as he ordered the archers to hold off the orcs, while Briol's force took over the assault. At the top, our protagonists confidently climbed the uneven cliff wall, and the rest of Briol's squad followed beneath him, their armor scraping the stone. They were all already tired, while the ascent was led by Prince Yuri, who climbed with unwavering concentration. The tired knight urged the prince to conserve his strength before the battle. Yuri merely sighed and chided him for his terrible stamina. His attention remained focused on the climb. He noted that the archers were gaining precious time, so their unit couldn't afford to fall behind. But his thoughts were interrupted when he felt a change in the air. A warning. His eyes widened as a huge boulder came crashing down towards them, the knights below screaming. Yuri's hand reached for the magical daggers on his belt, channeling mana through them, and all 4 blades burst free, swirling around him before shooting upward. They dug into the rock in a vertical line, forming a glowing set of steps, and Yuri jumped, using the daggers as support, and rushing upward with inhuman speed. Mana pulsed within him, refining his movements until he got close to the falling boulder. Drawing his sword and calming his breathing, he split the boulder with one clean blow. The 2 halves thundered past him, and before he fell, he thrust his sword into the cliff wall and grabbed it with both hands to slow his fall. After hanging like that for a moment and breathing heavily, he loosened one hand to look down and shouted, asking if the others were safe. The knights confirmed that they were safe, their voices echoing across the rock. Gigi smiled and said that it was good and hurried them. And then with a sharp jerk, he released the sword and used the recoil to launch himself upward again. He ran along the cliff, then jumped to the very top and landed on one knee at the top, where he was instantly surrounded by snarling orcs. Muttering that he appreciated such a warm welcome, he watched as the orcs hissed at him, trying to pronounce his name. One of them finally growled out the insult clearly, and Yuri rushed forward in a flash of mana and cut off his right hand, sending it flying through the air. The beast squealed, and then swung the remaining weapon and hit Yuri in the ribs, after which a flash passed through him. The main character cringed in pain. He forced himself to straighten up as the orc changed his grip and prepared to strike again. But steel met steel as Yuri intercepted the attack. He studied the creature with a cold gaze and noted that the loss of his arm had taken more strength from him than he realized. But before he could finish his thought, other orcs rushed at him from all sides. Muttering that this was starting to irritate him, he moved again, his blade cutting through the weapon of one orc, then the torso of another. He turned around and cut off the third one's leg, and the fourth caught him by surprise from behind, forcing him to twist and block the blow with clenched teeth. Struggling with the orc's strength, he glanced at the edge of the cliff and shouted down, demanding an answer as to how much longer the knights planned to mess around, to which one finally appeared, saying that they were almost there. Seconds later, Jared and Laurent climbed over the edge, and struck without pause, in perfect rhythm, killing 2 orcs. Yuri plunged his sword into the throat of another orc, and then he turned to the others and gave the order. There was no time to rest. They were to attack the second they reached the surface, to which the knights responded with a unanimous roar. One by one, they poured over the ledge into the fight, and the cliff top became a storm of steel, blood, and screams as the orcs clashed with the men of Briol. Far below, Ragnas stood at the mouth of the valley and looked at the dust rising from the rocks. And while the echo of the battle resounded in the night, a proud smile touched his face. That night, in the camp rebuilt after the skirmish, the soldiers were healing their wounds. Under the banner of Briol, a voice inside the command tent reported that the hidden enemy units had been eliminated. Jared reported to Prince Yuri, seated at the table, that the main forces would pass through the rift without losses. He concluded his report by mentioning the citadel of Karuya, Oakway's subordinate. Yuri approved the report, praising Jared. Jared added that the princess of the Holy Kingdom had asked him to deliver a message, and Yuri, intrigued, quietly uttered Sabia's name. And Jared explained, she said she was annoyed at how he kept collecting all the achievements for himself, but could send priests if he needed support. Having finished, he looked closely at the prince and suggested that there was something more between Yuri and the princess, but immediately cut himself off, calling it just speculation. Yuri sharply rejected this suggestion and, dissatisfied with the conversation, waved his hand, dismissing Jared. He bowed respectfully, wished them a good rest, and left the tent, after which silence fell over the room. Yuri remained at the table, his eyes skimming the ink lines of the map. He sighed and muttered that he had been hoping for a moment of rest, but fate seemed to disagree. Without looking up, he sensed someone behind him, and asked how long she had been standing there. Turning to Asuna, she stepped forward calmly and confidently, telling him that she had found the stranger. Yuri finally turned around, and his face reflected keen interest. He said that she had arrived just in time, and asked where the stranger was now. Asuna pointed to an area on the map and explained that the person was currently there. Yuri leaned closer, asking if that meant the stranger was in orc territory, to which she nodded and clarified that it seemed so. Yuri rubbed his chin, wondering out loud if the stranger was collaborating with the orcs. But Asuna quickly dismissed it, saying that the truth seemed to be the exact opposite. She explained that she hadn't gone any deeper because of the guards, but had learned of the stranger's capture. With a hint of concern, she warned Yuri to be careful. She said she knew he had a personal interest in the man, but his capture seemed deliberate, like part of a larger plan, and continued to argue that if the Allied forces intervened directly, the stranger may even turn against them. Yuri asked her to confirm that the stranger had indeed become a prisoner. She nodded again, but still suggested going back and conducting an investigation. Yuri replied that there was no need. He smiled, as the situation offered the opportunity to meet the stranger in person. Realizing he only desired Aqua's head, Yuri decided to lure him over to his side for their shared goals. He ordered Asuna to infiltrate the orc barracks the moment the battle began tomorrow and monitor the stranger's condition until his arrival. She didn't answer, just looked at him with eyes clouded with worry. Yuri noticed this and asked what was bothering her. She came closer to the table and said that if he intended to meet the stranger in person, she wanted to accompany him. With fierce determination, she addressed him as her prince, saying that the stranger was dangerous and she would protect him. Yuri looked at her for a long time, then stood up, meeting her gaze, and in a cold tone, he stated that he had not hired her to be a bodyguard and that he was quite capable of protecting himself. Her shoulders slumped. She bowed her head low under her hood and bit her lip to hide her feelings. She nodded and said she understood, and Yuri sighed. Then, forcing the lightness back into his voice, he turned to grab something from the side table and asked if she would like a nightcap before leaving, mentioning that he had recently received something. He put the appetizer on a plate and said that it was excellent. But when he turned around, Asuna had already disappeared. Only a faint trace of her mana hung in the air. Later that night, around the campfire with the knights, Jared told one of Yuri's favorite stories from his youth. He described the moment when Death Knights appeared behind the young prince. He puffed out his chest and declared that he had stepped forward to protect him. As the older knight, Jared had a moment to brag. The younger knights listened with awe, and Yuri, frying his snack on the fire, thought to himself that Jared was shamelessly lying. He remembered Jared snoring on the ground until Yuri kicked him awake, but he still admitted that Jared had gotten better over the years. One knight asked Yuri if Jared's story was true. Yuri almost blurted out how it really was, but instead replied that Jared did everything he could. The admiring knight asked how Jared had found the courage to face the Death Knight. He proudly replied that the enemy was material and could be fought with a blade. Then, with a stern expression, he added that the worst enemy is something that has no form, like a ghost, because it cannot be cut down. Yuri watched their conversation, quietly enjoying such camaraderie, but when he looked at Jared, something changed in his field of vision. A ragged figure stood behind Jared. At first, he wondered who could wear such tattered clothes, but then his sharp eyes focused, and disbelief spread across his face. His eyes widened and his lips parted. He instantly jumped up and grabbed the hilt of his sword, ordering the knights to raise their weapons. Jared winced and asked what happened, to which Yuri replied that there was an orc there. Jared drew his sword and looked where Yuri was staring, but he saw nothing. Not wanting to stumble, he swallowed and softly asked if the prince was tired. Yuri remained tense, his gaze fixed on one spot, although Jared insisted that there was nothing there. The knights sat down with their weapons ready, waiting for an explanation, and Yuri demanded to know what they meant, stating that the orc was right in front of them and asking why they couldn't see him. He repeated that he was there. The invisible scout, realizing that the prince saw him, shuddered and ran away. Yuri immediately rushed after him. Jared shouted after him, asking where he was going. Yuri, with unwavering concentration, replied that he was going to catch the orc, and as he got closer, he realized that only he could see it. It was a hidden scout, disguised by magic. Yuri filled his body and blade with mana. He shouted that he would not let him get away and attacked. The blow was clean, but the orc dissolved in a whirlwind of dark steam and avoided the cut. From afar, he looked back with his lips curved in an evil grin, and before disappearing completely, released a dark substance into the air. Yuri stopped warily. The substance splashed on him, and disgust distorted his face. Asking what this abomination was, he released a burst of mana, knocking the substance from his body. She burned, falling down. He raised his hand, watching as her remains hissed, and said that an unclean aura spread through him. Concern crept into his voice as he used mana to burn away the remains. Still looking at his hand, he wondered out loud what it could even be. That night in the tent, Hernando listened to Yuri's explanation. He anxiously agreed that the creature could be an invisible avatar and called the situation extremely suspicious. Yuri confirmed this and said that the situation was serious as the enemy had slipped past them undetected. Crossing his legs on the chair, Yuri quickly summed up why he had rushed to the royal family's mage at such a late hour. He sat surrounded by playing cards and chips, with knights kneeling nearby as punishment, and noticed that he seemed to have arrived at a very busy moment. Hernando assumed the orc had escaped with magic, but Yuri's senses had detected it. The prince noted the danger of unpredictability in combat and asked about countermeasures like a firebomb. Hernando replied that only Bowshot could cast this spell, and that heavy magic could be disrupted. Yuri then asked him about the suspicious nature of the sorcery itself. Hernando, now calmer, replied that he was not sure, but suspected that the orcs were dabbling with forbidden power, probably mixing it with black magic. An alarmed Yuri asked about the danger, but Hernando dismissed it. He assured her that the magic tower had already investigated the matter and the situation was quite manageable. Having promised to focus primarily on dispelling the enemy's sorcerer's tricks, Yuri agreed and said that he would rely on him. And then, clasping his fingers, he added something else. Hernando responded politely. Yuri sternly held up a playing card as a warning. He asked them to overlook the gambling just this once, adding that Hernando was obliged to invite him in the future. He grinned cheerfully and nodded. The punished knights looked on in confusion as Yuri and Hernando began to exchange jokes about victories and defeats. Their laughter mingled with the groans of the knights, who were still serving their punishment. Meanwhile, somewhere in the night, the crows looked at the sky indifferently, and beneath them, rotting skeletons hung on homemade crosses. Not far from this grim spectacle, deep inside the orc base, a command was heard in their crude language. In the great hall, countless orcs with glowing red eyes knelt, awaiting orders. Their leader, radiating a crushing dark aura, sprawled on his throne and gave the order, to which the orcish shaman readily responded and began to read the spell. Dark red mana flowed from his hands, pouring into the kneeling warriors, and when the spell was completed, the orcs trembled like hungry predators, and their eyes blazed even brighter. A growl echoed as mana enveloped them, and the leader spoke the last two words in a low and fierce voice. At dawn, the morning silence at the Karuya camp was shattered by the sound of a horn. With this signal, the Allied forces announced the beginning of a full-scale assault. The camp was instantly awakened as High Commander Ragnar led the attack, and Yuri Briol, ready for battle, rose up in the saddle and gave the order to his army to rush forward. His words echoed across the battlefield like thunder, and the soldiers responded with a deafening roar, rushing after him in formation with raised blades. Yuri rushed forward, leading the squad straight to the orc gates, but before they even got close, orcs appeared behind the barricades. Their bows rose up in unison, and after a sharp signal, a real storm of arrows fell upon the people. The air filled with the whistle, causing Yuri to sharply pull on the reins, leading his horse into a sharp turn and give the order to retreat. Hooves tore up the ground as they changed formations, but arrows continued to pierce their ranks. Jared and Laurent managed to dodge, but behind them, the metal was already cutting in the flesh. The cries of the wounded and the thunder of hooves settled like a heavy stone in Yuri's chest. He forced himself to look only ahead, mentally ordering himself to move forward without looking back or hesitating. As he moved further, he realized the true nature of the trap. The orcs had focused all their attention on his squad, which was now acting as live bait. As he expected, while the orcs were raining down all their arrows on his men, Ragnar roared a new order and sent soldiers with a battering ram straight at the main gate. Their collective roar shook the air, and the battering ram with one brutal blow broke through the gates, smashing the heavy doors into splinters. Ragnar seized the breach and ordered the Imperial army to advance inside, whereupon the soldiers surged forward like a rolling wave of steel. As soon as Yuri had led his troops a sufficient distance away and the shelling had died down, he pulled the reins and stopped, and his army followed his example. He listened through the settling dust and, recognizing the rumble of Ragnar's assault in the depths of the camp, announced that their role as bait was over and it was time to regroup. But Sir Jose interrupted him. Stepping forward with the wounded soldiers, he declared that the frontal attack had stretched the orcs' forces thin and that a rear attack would crush the enemy much more quickly. Yuri almost laughed at such audacity, calling the idea smart but pointing his hand at the back wall. This part was a solid, heavily fortified barrier, and they had no battering ram, to which Jose only grinned and gripped the hilt of his two-handed sword more tightly. Thick, pulsing mana began to swirl around his blade, and he noticed that siege weapons were not always needed. Having brought the concentration of mana to the limit, he dismounted and approached the fortress wall. While Yuri watched this with a mixture of awe and caution, mentally amazed at what was happening, Jose planted his feet firmly on the ground and poured more mana into his weapon and sharply turned the body, causing the earth to shake. Then he struck a blow that exploded forward with colossal force, like a wave rising from the ground, and crashed into the rear barricade, reducing it to dust in the blink of an eye. Stone and wood flew apart in a choking cloud of dust, through which the disoriented orcs staggered. One of them noticed the breach and raised the alarm, but Yuri did not waste a second. He rushed inside, praising Jose's work as he went, and as his speed cut through the air, the screaming orc lost his head from a single flash of steel. Immediately after the impact, Yuri slowed down and raised his voice, and ordered the soldiers of Briol to advance, pointing the bloody blade to the path ahead and declaring that their hour had come. He rode straight towards the hastily thrown-together barricade by the orcs, ordering his army to tear it down, and as they approached, the knights urged their steeds to leap. Yuri called for them all to be killed, while on the other side, the orcs were already preparing for defense, raising their spears. But before the orcs could strike from below, one of the knights leaped over them, knocking off all the spearheads with a single steel swing. The knights landed flawlessly, and Sir Jared, sword in hand, charged with fierce conviction, shouting a battle cry in honor of Briol. Laurent, galloping alongside, looked at Jared in surprise. Yuri, however, noticed a bright flame in Jared and saw the same spark of rivalry ignite in Laurent. Laurent drew his sword, rushed forward, and shouted as he went that he had no choice but to keep up. Jared reached the front lines, where the orcs were riding on monstrous creatures, and rushed straight at them, and then suddenly jumped off his horse. He spun in the air before the eyes of the shocked orcs, and landed unwaveringly on one knee, managing to cut one of the enemies exactly in half before even touching the ground. He rushed forward again and plunged his blade into the skull of another orc, and he raised his free hand, shouting out words of relief and swearing allegiance to Prince Yuri Briol. Nearby, soaked in orc blood, Jose noticed Jared and laughed as Briol's troops continued to steal every cool moment. The soldiers around him roared even louder, and Jose ordered his wounded men to press harder, not wanting to let Briol's powers overshadow Brizen. As the battle continued, Yuri noted that their offensive was bearing fruit. The orc line had thinned, and the initiative was on their side. But even so, a feeling of unease crept into his chest, and he thought that something was wrong, since the main force of the orcs had not yet appeared. And then they struck like a black wave, the orc troops pouring in overwhelming numbers, moving with terrible discipline. They instantly cut through the ranks and crushed the people. The knights blindly rushed into the attack, until one of them finally identified the enemy and shouted the loud warning. Those who reached them before this cry died without striking a single blow. And still sitting in the saddle, Jared looked at the falling bodies, feeling growing panic. Suddenly, one of the orcs rushed straight at him, killing the soldier in front with one brutal blow and turning to Laurent. And then he loomed over Jared with his axe raised, letting out a roar that made everything inside him shake. It was only at that moment that Jared realized that he was in mortal danger. But then, Yuri burst in with a lightning attack, ordering Jared to pull himself together, and intercepted the blow. Sparks flew in all directions as the steel collided, and Jared could think only of his prince with a trembling relief. Yuri suddenly asked if Jared had planned to die, especially after he bragged just once, and ordered him to regain his fighting stance. He did so. Casting aside his fear, Jared obeyed, and they attacked together. Yuri cut off the orc's arm, and Jared cut off his leg, knocking the monster face down into the dirt, along with the flag. Jared apologized, but Yuri, already focusing all his attention on the battlefield, only told him to stay alert. Then Yuri's gaze darted to the hut in the depths of the camp, where he sensed the presence of something much more terrible. And at that moment, an orc came out from there, holding a severed human head in his hand, like a trophy. The corpses behind him were torn apart with deliberate cruelty, and a suffocating pressure emanated from the creature itself. It was Karui, the camp commander. Outside, Jose shouted that the enemy line had been broken and ordered his men to press their advantage, not wanting to give in to Briol soldiers, while Yuri and Jared simultaneously felt a wave of pressure coming from the neighboring tent. Yuri pointed this out to Jared. He confirmed he felt it too and asked about the prince's plans. Yuri ordered them to follow him and moved forward. As they ran toward the tent, Jared asked if the main forces had yet encountered whatever was inside. Yuri replied that he hoped they weren't too late, but his thought was interrupted when the body of a soldier flew out of the hut and crashed hard into the camp wall. A heavy orcish stomping could be heard inside, and using the recoil, the orc soared upward in one leap, rushing past them. Jared barely had time to realize what exactly flashed past, while the cursing Yuri turned around, and the orc had already rushed towards the soldiers behind them and jumped again, and with a roar, crashed right into the center of their formation. 4 people were killed instantly by one circular swing, collapsing dead before anyone even realized what was happening. Soon the orc was standing alone among the fresh corpses, and Yuri's grip on the sword hilt became deathly. A nervous Jared called out to him, but instead of answering, Yuri ordered all the soldiers to retreat, feeling rage boiling inside him, while his gaze was fixed on Karui. He repeated the order, knowing he couldn't hold back his power, and stepped towards Karui. The orc turned around, staring at him with clear, killing intent, which is why Jared, in a panic, called out to his prince again. Jose, who had arrived, told Jared not to bother, noting that Yuri most likely couldn't hear anything right now, and added that he would fight alongside him. Yuri raised his sword and dealt a monstrous blow, which Karui met head-on, causing mana and metal to collide in a shower of sparks. The monster and the protagonist's faces almost collided from the onslaught. Karui then overwhelmed him with force, forcing him to retreat until Yuri thrust his sword into the ground to stop himself, mentally acknowledging that one direct hit from the orc would drop him dead. The two-handed sword of Jose, who had approached, landed next to him. He noticed that Yuri seemed to be having problems. He put the weapon on his shoulder and declared his readiness to help, to which Yuri agreed. Watching Yuri, Jose thought about the wolf. In a desperate situation protecting her cubs, recognizing in him the same fearless determination, and Yuri's stance, which perfectly understood the nature of war, became more rigid. Even though he was young, Jose understood that this was no ordinary soldier in front of him. And at that moment, a white aura flared up around our main character. Karui grinned and gestured for them to come over. Yuri gave a sign to Jose, who nodded, and they rushed into attack with lightning speed. Jose reached Karuya first and struck. He was heavily charged with mana, but the orc blocked it cleanly. They exchanged a flurry of blows, without giving in to each other an inch. a man and an orc with the same strength. They continued to exchange dozens of blows per second. Yuri jumped up to strike from behind, but surprisingly, Karui quickly dodged, grabbed Yuri by the shoulder with a strong and tenacious grip, and threw it aside, continuing to cross blades with Jose. Karui then noticed a small cut on his palm and looked at it with embarrassment, and Yuri, who had risen to his feet, said with a weak, bloody smile that even a small wound should cause concern. He added that their knights would destroy the proud Karui orcs, and suggested that he test how long he could hold out against the two of them, putting his sword forward and waiting for that moment. When it was more convenient for Jose to grab his weapon, they attacked together again, and Karui took both blows. Jose's sword with his axe, and Yuri's blade with his bare hand. But their pressure forced him to exert all his strength. Suddenly, Karui tore the block apart and let out a deafening roar, and a dark force burst out of his body. The sky instantly darkened. There was an unnatural clap of thunder, and the frozen Jose asked what it was. Feeling the same vile aura, Yuri gritted his teeth. Shrouded in black smoke, Karui stood with glowing red eyes, and his muscles bulged as his aura pulsed. Yuri recognized the sensation, eerily similar to what he'd experienced from the ghostly sorcerer, and ordered Jose to retreat. But the warning was too late. Karui cut Jose's chest, while Yuri shouted at him to dodge. However, refusing to fall, Jose stayed on his feet, and screaming from above, even with a completely cut body, met the next blow with a defense charged with mana, breaking the grip at exactly that moment, when Yuri went on the attack again. But Karui twisted again and intercepted the blow. Yuri jumped back as Karui's counterattack plowed the ground, and asked Jose if he could still fight, to which Jose replied in the affirmative. Based on his observations, Jose stated that with the appearance of smoke, Karui's power increased to the skies. Yuri agreed with him, mentally noting that the aura matched the aura of the ghostly sorcerer. And this was alarming since Hernando was supposed to be dispelling the dark magic at that very moment. 10 fallen orcs began to rise, shrouded in the same smoke, and high above them in the air, a dark figure with glowing red eyes hung invisibly. The atmosphere gave way to something cold and vile, heralding the arrival of a deeply unnatural force, and from the shadows burst a swarm of demonic soldiers, their twisted bodies and glowing red eyes betraying their cursed origins. The leader of the beasts let out a roar and rushed to attack, breaking through the ground with its massive bulk as it approached the human ranks. Yuri and Jose immediately changed positions, but one of the knights reacted too late and fell right in front of the monsters. The enemy struck again with lightning speed, so Yuri ordered the knight to retreat while he took the attacker head-on, without hesitation, rushing forward and engaging the monster in a direct confrontation. With the screeching of blades and the shower of sparks, he held his position under incredible pressure, pushed the creature back for a moment, and then, changing his stance, he delivered a heavy chopping blow. His blow went deep, leaving a dark, spreading wound that made the enemy stagger. Before dark, mana burst out of him. Yuri recoiled in surprise, saw in shock, as a dark silhouette stepped out of the darkness within the orc, its eyes glowing like smoldering coals. This new figure seemed much more dangerous. It was drawing dark energy from the body of the fallen orc. And then it broke free. Stunned by this transformation, Yuri froze. The creature evolved, rising from death and turning into something far more terrifying. Black tentacles burst out of it, whipping through the air, and one of them grabbed Yuri, dragging him towards itself. Shadows wrapped around his arms and legs, tightening as he fought to stay conscious. And through the fog, the voice of the entity echoed, calling him by name, and declaring its intention to devour him. Yuri fell into an illusion where he was surrounded by ghostly faces from the past. Family, comrades, fallen soldiers, and each of them accused him of treason. Their voices grew louder, calling him a disappointment. Their distorted faces brought his guilt to the surface. And then the shadow addressed him by his full name, Yuri Briol, declaring that none of his actions could change fate. In the darkness, a huge red eye formed, mocking his resistance and proclaiming that his end was sealed. But Yuri refused to accept this and forced himself to take a step forward, breaking the grip of the illusion. An aged Yuri from his past life appeared next to him. Without saying a word, the man raised his sword to the heavens. Their powers merged, releasing a flash of light that drove back the darkness, and they completely rejected the concept of fate, with its position demanding a future shaped by choice, not prophecy. All this time, even his very small version helped him. The shadow struck again, but Yuri cut through them. His sword glowed with bright blue mana when he made a clear path through the defiled space. He moved forward, cutting through illusory enemies as the crushing weight around him eased. And, acting confidently, he felt the initiative shift to him, and the nightmare's control began to crack. Yuri unleashed another powerful blow, breaking through the creature's defenses, which is why the damned fog squealed and distorted under the force of the onslaught. He soared upward, cutting through layers of magical resistance until the battlefield was illuminated by the energy of his attack, and then brought his blade down in a massive arc straight into the creature's core. The tide of the battle turned. The blow shook the earth, and the dark barrier holding the illusion began to crack, and then completely shattered into pieces. The desecrated space collapsed, revealing a real battlefield beneath him, where Yuri found himself face to face with a cloaked figure, possessing a distorted smile and blackened teeth. The creature began to tremble, its body beginning to disintegrate from the damage it had received, while Yuri did not lower his weapon, feeling that the corrupting force within the enemy was fading away. With the spell broken, their side finally had a chance to turn the tide of the battle, and he shouted to the others that it was time to strike back. In response, even more enemies appeared, ready to resist. But under the leadership of Yuri and Jose, the human troops rushed forward. Their battle cries echoed through the air as steel clashed again. Shields were shattered into pieces, blades struck their targets, bodies fell. But the people continued to advance. A distant noise caught Yuri's attention. The orc commander, still locked in battle with Jose, he leaped forward and fell upon him, instantly crushing the man's resistance. The blow sent Jose flying, and fighting to stay conscious, he felt blood rushing down his face. Yuri saw him fall, but he couldn't reach him in time, since the orc had already started moving again. The creature raised the weapon as high as possible, on the surface of which red energy pulsed, preparing to finish off the victim. Jose yelled at Yuri to stay away, but the prince ignored the warning. The orc turned to Yuri with eyes burning with bloodlust, and he rushed straight towards the approaching blow. Yuri took a stance, refusing to give in, and mentally confirmed his convictions. Even under the threat of death, he had no intention of retreating and intended to carry the burden of each fallen comrade until the very end. There was a clash of steel. Blood was spilled, and the orc howled in pain, seeing his limb in the air, for the attack had torn his arm, causing his strength to waver. Yuri remained standing in amazement as another warrior approached him, impressed by his performance. The man smiled at Yuri and acknowledged his achievements with obvious respect. Having declared that he liked him, a new ally arrived. With one swing, the stranger's blade tore Karui's arm from his body, causing blood to spurt out in a cruel fountain. After which, the warrior straightened up, shook the blood off the steel, and began to watch as the orc fell to his knees. Karui howled, clutching his mangled stump as rage and agony contorted his massive frame. But when his head was low enough, the stranger stepped forward and grabbed the orc by the horn and jerked his muzzle up. He ordered Karui to stop yelling and added with sharp indignation that the orc hadn't even bothered to amuse him, while Prince Yuri watched from behind, trying to remember who this man was. His accent, heavy build, and unusual posture all aroused suspicion. And then Yuri noticed the way the man raised his sword for the finishing blow. The movement flowed in an alien rhythm, completely unlike their styles. Yuri recognized this technique and, as soon as it dawned on him, he began to speak. However, before he could finish his thought, the stranger's blade drew a clean arc and cut off Karui's head, causing a horrific fountain of blood. Calm and indifferent, the stranger turned away with Karui's head dangling in his hand. And looking at this cold departure, Yuri realized that he had finally found the person he was looking for. After moving a short distance, the man turned around completely and said that he intervened only because Yuri's actions made an impression on him. However, these same actions thwarted several of his plans. He was already about to explain what he meant, but Yuri bowed deeply and interrupted him and loudly thanked him for saving his life, to which the bewildered man stared back as the prince continued to shower him with praise. Yuri noted the strength, aura, and rare skill of the stranger who had killed the commander. The man tried to speak, but the prince approached him closely and called him the strongest warrior. The stranger narrowed his eyes and asked what Yuri was getting at, to which he responded bluntly. He said he knew the man hadn't let the orcs grab him for no reason, and, smiling slightly, suggested that the reason must be the hunt for Okva, the orc king, after which he proposed joining forces. The stranger was shocked. And the scene switched, and soon after the fall of Karui, the orc line was finally broken. A massacre followed, and as soon as the massacre was over, Ragnar impaled Karui's head on a spear. In Yuri's first life, nothing like such a victory had ever happened, which meant a complete change in a no longer entirely predetermined history. By evening, the prince returned to his tent, his armor soaked in orc blood, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. Jared greeted him. After praising Yuri's combat performance, he handed him a cloth. Yuri wiped his face and asked about losses. Jared replied that data collection was ongoing, but the damage so far appeared to be manageable. However, what was far more alarming was the number of soldiers whose psyches were shattered by the horrors they had witnessed inside the Karui barracks. Having acknowledged this cost, Yuri fell silent, and his thoughts turned to the past, to memories of human women, thrown into dungeons and forced to bear orcish children while they begged for death. And if that place was hell, the Karui barracks were perhaps even worse. Yuri let out a grim sigh and ordered Jared to take care of the injured soldiers and keep their spirits up. Jared nodded firmly, after which Yuri inquired about the foreigner's affairs. Jared reported that all his requests had been satisfied, but this man turned out to be unbearably problematic. He was always hungry, constantly complaining, and endlessly indignant that the food was not the same. He ate, washed, shaved, and then immediately demanded more food. He even flipped the table over after being served overly salty soup, and refused to eat until 5 plates were placed in front of him at once. Yuri could only sigh, saying that he would deal with him personally, and asking where this man was now. Jared assumed he was near the central fire, and under the night sky, Yuri did indeed find a foreigner sitting in front of the flames, surrounded by empty plates, chewing rhythmically. When Yuri remarked out loud that he had finally found it, the man looked back, but immediately returned his attention to the fire, after which the prince asked if he had enjoyed the food. The foreigner muttered that it was so-so, and when he finally finished everything down to the last crumb, he patted himself on the stomach with satisfaction and announced that the meal had been a success. Yuri waited and was about to speak, but the foreigner interrupted him, with unexpected harshness, demanding to be told. How exactly did Yuri defeat the orc sorcerer? The prince tried to answer, but the man stood up abruptly and declared that since Yuri claimed to know his purpose, now he will have to lay everything out in the open. And at the same time, the stranger's hand lay on the sword. He added that depending on the answer, Yuri could very well die, which made the prince swallow, gathering his courage. He answered honestly, admitting that he himself did not fully understand how he did it, but his method of using mana simply reacted on its own, and the sorcerer fell. The foreigner asked if he meant the internal cultivation technique by the mana method, but Yuri did not answer with words. He released his mana, allowing an aura to flare around him, and with calm determination he stated that this technique was inherited from his ancestor, Briol. The foreigner studied him silently, and then looked away and muttered that their meeting must have been destined, to which a confused Yuri asked what he meant. The man explained that Yuri's technique and his ancestor's name were of great significance, and then he folded his hands together and bowed. He introduced himself as the last direct disciple and head of the Changshan sect, expressing his respect to the descendant of their ancient benefactor and adding that the sect had never forgotten the friendship of the heaven-smashing swordsman. Yuri could only stutter, barely able to pronounce the word benefactor, to which the man advised him not to be surprised. All that was in the past. He explained that Briol was known among them as the heaven-crushing swordsman, and that he once joined forces with a sect to destroy a demonic cult. Still in shock, Yuri asked what kind of cult it was, to which the foreigner replied that they practiced human sacrifice, and the Changshan sect existed precisely to destroy those who followed this path. He added that he came to the west to destroy the ominous star that had appeared, and Yuri noticed again how fluent the man's speech became whenever he spoke seriously. Then the foreigner sighed, admitting that the sect had long since fallen, and then Yuri realized that it was this very mission that was the reason for this man's obsession with killing Okva in his past life. Realizing he couldn't let such a valuable combat unit go alone, Yuri suggested they work together. The foreigner was shocked, and Yuri explained that the Briol family would grant him the title of honorary knight, allowing him to carry out his mission as part of the allied army. The man fell silent, deep in thought, but Yuri continued to insist, offering food, baths, comfort, and universal respect. He assured that with a knighthood, no one would dare look down on him. And at the end of the war, he promised to secure him a place in a major trading union. The foreigner muttered something irreverently under his breath, clearly captivated by the idea of such wealth. And a moment later, he coughed, declaring that since Yuri insisted so much, he agreed, but on one condition. Pointing to the tense Yuri, he said that he liked him. From now on, Yuri had to call him teacher, which is why the prince froze in his tracks, barely managing to squeeze out a silent something. The foreigner brushed aside his hesitation and remarked that there was a price to be paid for Yuri's elevation, but the prince was obliged to be grateful for such a rare honor. Yuri gave an awkward laugh and thanked him, although he admitted that he already had a teacher. But as soon as he mentioned the sword demon, the foreigner's face instantly distorted with displeasure. The man snapped that Yuri could be a student of both of them, after which he crossed his arms over his chest with theatrical irritation, muttering that he had no idea of his value. And without giving the prince a chance to get a word in, he demanded that he be taken immediately to the commander of the Allied forces. Yuri just blinked his eyes in confusion and mumbled an apology, but the foreigner reminded him that he himself had offered to help, and since the prince needed to know something critical about the orcs, they had to hurry. The evening had already turned to night when these explanations finally reached Ragnar's tent, inside which someone recounted in detail the foreigner's words about human sacrifices. Ragnar sat at his desk, his fingers intertwined, and looked piercingly at the foreigner, asking if this Okua really used people in his rituals, to which the guest sitting next to Yuri confirmed that human lives were sacrificed to fuel the orcish witchcraft, and that Okua himself had already been completely corrupted by filth. This statement brought Yuri back to the memories of the recent battle, and he explained that the enemy orcs' strength had suddenly surged, causing them to suspect dark magic. So if the enemy had the conditions to freely use such power, people urgently needed countermeasures. The foreigner added that it was precisely for the sake of getting closer to Okua that he pretended to be a victim, angrily grumbling that the Allied forces had ruined everything, which is why Yuri shuddered at such disrespect for Ragnar and hastened to officially assure the commander that the guest had nevertheless agreed to cooperate. Regaining his composure, the prince added that since this man's goal was to eliminate Okua, he would undoubtedly become a valuable ally, after which Ragnar fell into deep thought, resting his chin on his hand, until Yuri caught his attention. Ragnar straightened up, crossed his arms over his chest, and replied that he understood everything, promising to assign people to find ways to counteract the magic, after which he turned to Yuri and announced that from now on, this foreigner would be under his personal responsibility. Yuri thanked him, grateful for their alliance in this chaos, but just as the prince was preparing to leave, Ragnar called his name again, causing him to turn around. He said that he had heard about Yuri's intention to take the half-orc with him and asked if it was true, to which Yuri, without the slightest hesitation, answered in the affirmative. Ragnar sighed with concern and reported that the captured half-orcs were now under the care of Sir Graham. However, the disputes about their fate were still ongoing, so he asked Yuri to make the final decision himself. Later that night, under a bright moon, Yuri walked around the area where the half-orcs were kept and silently watched them, realizing that although Ragnar's trust flattered him, this responsibility was simply pushed onto him, causing a cold sweat to run down his back. Suddenly, a loud cry broke the silence. Someone was furiously protesting that they were allowing House Briol to outdo them. Turning around, Yuri found two knights arguing, one of whom angrily insisted that the use of half-orcs, especially as translators, will give the Empire a huge advantage. Another one gloomily reminded them that the surviving people behind them had suffered at the hands of these very half-orcs, and declared their duty to listen to the victims, to which the first knight only snorted derisively, insisting that it would be foolish to miss such an important opportunity. The people standing behind them simply trembled. Yuri came out of the shadows with a sigh and asked, was this the reason for their discord, causing both knights to freeze? He turned to the first knight and asked, could he really guarantee the usefulness of half-orcs in battle? To which the knight beat himself on the chest, assuring them that they were obedient and easy to train. Yuri's tone turned icy when he asked if the knight would be able to, or death. It is safe to entrust your back to one of these creatures. The knight hesitated, unable to answer, and Yuri looked towards the half-orcs and added that the soldiers on the front lines needed comrades who can be relied upon in moments of greatest vulnerability. Leaving the knight speechless, he approached the injured people, and one of the women visibly flinched at his appearance. Yuri calmly met her gaze and asked what she had witnessed, and when she hesitated, he asked her directly how exactly the orcs treated the defenseless people. A strong tremor came over her, and she clenched her jaw, forcing herself to speak and telling through tears how her wounded and immobilized younger sister was killed, literally tore into pieces before her and another woman's eyes. She remembered how the orcs laughed, amused by the cries of the unfortunate, and treating a dying person like a toy. And now, tears rolled down her face as she assured Yuri that this was the true essence of the orcs. Yuri put his hand on her shoulder encouragingly, asking her name and where she was from, to which she introduced herself as Jane of Sitter, and having learned the color of his hair, she timidly asked if he was Prince Briala. He confirmed it, and then her eyes flashed with anger. When she began desperately begging him for revenge, Yuri felt righteous anger boiling inside him, and promised that she would get her revenge, after which he immediately called for Sir Graham. When Graham stepped forward, Yuri announced that he was now speaking as Prince Briala, and not as a commander, claiming that these creatures had exterminated the innocent citizens of his kingdom and inflicted incurable mental wounds on the survivors. He saw no reason to recognize the value of those who trampled human lives in cold blood, and his rage flared even more as he proclaimed that the orcs would never change. He firmly ordered the destruction of every half-orc, and Graham, pressing his hand to his chest, bowed deeply, unquestioningly accepting this command. A cool breeze caressed the camp that night. But at dawn, the morning air was disturbed. He was suddenly torn apart by the warning roar of a horn from the guard post. The sentry screamed shrilly about the approach of the orcs, causing the entire camp to instantly start moving. And the first to appear on the horizon were the orc riders. Orcish messengers with banners on their backs. They approached boldly in a small group, riding on their creatures, raising the question of what intention was hidden behind this spectacle. One of the soldiers ran up to Ragnar, reporting that the orcs had allegedly arrived for negotiations. The soldier insisted on the truth of his words, adding that the orcs were demanding that the gates be opened for some message, causing Ragnar's face to distort with anger when he asked what they were up to and ordered the gates to be unlocked. The ranks of soldiers quickly obeyed, and the Orkvol rode inside without the slightest hesitation, looming menacingly over Ragnar and Yuri. He smirked, looking down at them, while they stood firmly in place, not taking their eyes off the enemy messenger. Several orcish messengers with banners on their backs were shifting around near the palisade, grumbling among themselves, while the allied soldiers passed by, whispering as they walked and hurrying to take cover in the depths of the camp. Inside the command tent, Supreme Commander Ragnar sat at his desk with a crumpled letter in his hand when Prince Yuri entered and respectfully inquired about the reason for his summons. Ragnar looked up, called Yuri by name, and suddenly asked why the prince thought he was the one leading the allied forces, to which Yuri, taken by surprise, replied that it was probably due to Ragnar's outstanding military talents. Ragnar waved it off, noting that he was not talking about these obvious things at all. And when Yuri clarified whether he meant political overtones, Ragnar confirmed his suspicions. He admitted to Yuri that he wasn't on the best terms with the Emperor, and although his status as a prince of the Empire obliges him to possess the corresponding power, imperial affairs are never simple, adding that when everything goes smoothly and sensibly, there are almost always hidden intrigues of the ruler behind it. He continued, arguing that if he won, his name would thunder across the continent, making him a hero, whose future destiny will be strewn with praise and support. But then he made a slip of the tongue with a tired smile, that this was only possible if they won, and these words stirred up Yuri's deeply hidden memories. Yuri recalled how, in his past life, Ragnar had taken the blame for defeat and lost influence, while the Emperor seized power in an alliance created only to fail, and Ragnar was ultimately simply thrown out. Remembering this past, Yuri cautiously asked whether the commander-in-chief considered the current situation a trap. Ragnar didn't answer, but instead simply threw the letter across the table and told Yuri to read it. Yuri caught the paper, unfolded it, and his gaze instantly sharpened as he read the warning that the Emperor had made a secret pact with Okua, and Ragnar was strongly advised to retreat so as not to become a senseless scapegoat. Absorbing these lines, Yuri thought gloomily that the outcome of this war was predetermined from the very beginning, mentally cursing this dirty scheme, while Ragnar, who was watching him, explained that the message allegedly came from some anonymous organization opposing Okua. He added that if what was written turns out to be true, then everything was orchestrated in advance, and the Allied forces were initially left with no chance to return alive. After which, he asked Yuri what he thought about it. Yuri froze for a moment, while the paper rustled in his gauntlet, and then voiced his desire to propose. And when Ragnar told him to speak, the prince declared that regardless of the authenticity of the letter, they are obliged to return victorious, adding that this knowledge only makes an already difficult battle a little more troublesome, and nothing more. Ragnar burst into loud laughter and slapped the armrest of his chair and rose to his feet, agreeing that Yuri's words were true, for no matter what intrigues the Emperor may hatch, they will have no place in this world unless they return triumphant. Turning away, he concluded that all that remained now was to deal with those who had delivered this letter. But just as he was about to give orders, Yuri turned to him. Looking firmly at Ragnar, he asked him to entrust the orc messengers to him personally, much to the commander's surprise. Outside the palisade, bulky orcish messengers milled about the stakes, grumbling and swearing in their guttural language, and one of them, baring his fangs, barked something sharply to the others. But the sound instantly died down as the ominous presence approached. A black, smoke-like aura swirled around Yuri as he walked towards them, dragging his cloak and creaking through the mud with his armored boots. And when yet another orc shouted something again in his rough dialect, Yuri only narrowed his eyes and with icy fury cut off their noise, ordering them to shut the hell up. The next moment, he drew his sword, the blade of which outlined a magnificent arc of dazzling blue light, and from this swing a crushing force erupted. The sword stroke stretched out like a shining path, cutting through the air along with the orcs' bodies, and this powerful blow ripped through their flesh with a single swing. When the light faded, Yuri landed smoothly, turning his back to the corpses collapsing behind him, while the allied soldiers watched from afar in shock. One of them loudly exclaimed his amazement that Yuri had taken out 3 orcs with a single blow, and the other one whispered in shock that he had no idea that Prince Briol had such incredible skills. Ragnar, who was standing nearby, narrowed his eyes, noting that this was quite impressive, especially considering that Yuri was only 18 years old with such abilities. Slightly unsettled by this display of ruthlessness, the knight asked him if the prince was overstepping his bounds, but at that moment, the severed orc head was pierced by a brutal blow from above, spraying blood. Observing this chilling spectacle, Ragnar commented that Yuri apparently made some kind of promise, because as he walked along the palisade, the stakes behind him were already full of the bodies and heads of orcs with drooping banners. Ragnar continued to explain that Yuri had sworn revenge and made the enemy pay in full. Later, under the rays of the crimson sunset, the army marched through the valley, and Ragnar stood, silently watching the endless column of soldiers and waving flags. Without turning around, he ordered his men to bring Eisen, to which the knight respectfully promised to immediately fulfill his master's will. Soon, an elderly man in a witch's robe arrived, leaning on his staff. It was Eisen, the imperial court mage, who asked if the commander-in-chief had summoned him. Turning to face him, Ragnar ordered him to tell him everything he knew about black magic, and Eisen thoughtfully repeated these words. And then he explained that black magic was considered an outdated art that was once rumored as if it were capable of resurrecting the dead, although such tales were now dismissed as superstitions, and then reported that Okua was using dark magic fueled by human sacrifices. Ragnar remembered the previous battle, noticing that they had already felt this power on themselves, and expected the orcs to only become stronger. To which Eisen added that if the reports were true, the orcs could have come into possession of an entire grimoire of black magic. Ragnar reacted violently, and Eisen explained that these planes still held many secrets, like the vanished state of Attican and its creations of dark sorcery. The Death Knight Gert, one of the 10 most powerful creatures in the world, after which Ragnar asked why exactly Okua needed such power. Eisen replied that in his personal opinion, Okua was trying to summon some kind of creature, and Ragnar gloomily stated that this fully explained the delay in their march and the hasty evacuation of the enemy's own troops. Eisen agreed, noting that all of this was done to buy time, and if the grimoire was already in Okua's hands, the summoning ritual could very well begin. While Ragnar was thinking about the fact that something was clearly happening deep below, the scene shifted to an underground cave, where, on a pedestal among piles of skulls, a blue relic, resembling a staff, flashed with a blinding light.